And hello, Karoth crew. So tonight I'm mixing it up a little bit. Instead of playing StarCraft, I am going to play Sea of Thieves. I'm hoping one of my friends are going to join me, and his name is Crazy Eyes, and he is a lot better at this game than I am. He has actually been trying to get me into this game for quite a long time, and I finally decided to pick it up and figure it out, especially since, well, so many members of the Rexel family are at sea. So I kind of thought it would be fitting for at least this part of where we are in the story. So, let's see. My friend Crazy Eyes is also going to join me in chat eventually. I'm going to start without him because I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm probably going to pause the story for a little bit to find out what I'm doing and to find out how to play as a team. But beyond that, let's get back to the story. No, doesn't like that button anymore.
Chapter 15 and 16 of the Grand Babylon Hotel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. The Grand Babylon Hotel by Arnold Bennett. Chapter 15. End of the Yacht Adventure. We must now return to Nella Rexel and Prince Aribert of Posen on board the yacht without a name. The prince's first business was to make Jules, otherwise Mr. Tom Jackson, perfectly secure by means of several pieces of rope. Although Mr. Jackson had been stunned into complete unconsciousness, and there was a contused wound under his ear, no one could say how soon he might not come to himself and get very violent. So the prince, having tied his arms and legs, made him fast to a stanchion. "I hope he won't die," said Nella. "He looks very white." "The Mr. Jacksons of this world," said Prince Aribert sententiously, "never die till they're hung. By the way, I wonder how it is that no one has interfered with us. Perhaps they are discreetly afraid of my revolver. Of your revolver, I mean." Both he and Nella glanced up at the imperturbable steersman, who kept the yacht's head straight out to sea. By this time they were about a couple of miles from the Belgian shore. Addressing him in French.
So he just admitted that she's the only one on board with a gun, and yet they abducted her. Such a ridiculous scenario.
The prince ordered the sailor to put the yacht about and make again for Ostend harbour, but the fellow took no notice whatever of the summons. The prince raised the revolver with the idea of frightening the steersman, and then the man began to talk rapidly in a mixture of French and Flemish. He said that he received Jules' strict orders not to interfere in any way, no matter what might happen on the deck of the yacht. He was the captain of the yacht, and he had to make for a certain English port, the name of which he could not divulge. He was to keep the vessel at full steam ahead under any and all circumstances. He seemed to be a very big, a very strong, and a very determined man, and the prince was at a loss what course of action to pursue. He asked several more questions, but the only effect of them was to render the man taciturn and ill-humoured. In vain Prince Aribert explained that Miss Nella Rexel, daughter of millionaire Rexel, had been abducted by Mr. Tom Jackson. In vain he flourished the revolver threateningly. The surly but courageous captain said merely that that had nothing to do with him. He had instructions, and he should carry them out. He sarcastically begged to remind his interlocutor that he was the captain of the yacht. "It won't do to shoot him, I suppose," said the prince to Nella. "I might bore a hole into his leg, or something of that kind." "It's rather risky, and rather hard on the poor captain, with his extraordinary sense of duty," said Nella. "And besides, the whole crew might turn on us. No, we must think of something else." "I wonder where the crew is," said the prince. Just then Mr. Jackson, prone and bound on the deck, showed signs of recovering from his swoon. His eyes opened, and he gazed vacantly around. At length he caught sight of the prince, who approached him with the revolver well in view. "It's you, is it?" he murmured faintly. "What are you doing on board? Who's tied me up like this?" "See here," replied the prince. "I don't want to have any arguments, but this yacht must return to Ostend at once, where you will be given up to the authorities." "Really," snarled Mr. Tom Jackson. "Shall I?" Then he called out in French to the man at the wheel. "Hi, Andre! Let these two be put off in the dinghy." It was a peculiar situation. Certain of nothing but the possession of Nella's revolver, the prince scarcely knew whether to carry the argument further and with stronger measures, or to accept the situation with as much dignity as the circumstances would permit. "Let us take the dinghy," said Nella. "We can row ashore in an hour." He felt that she was right. To leave the yacht in such a manner seemed somewhat ignominious, and it certainly involved the escape of that profound villain, Mr. Thomas Jackson. But what else could be done? The prince and Nella constituted one party on the vessel. They knew their own strength, but they did not know the strength of their opponents. They held the hostile ringleader bound and captive, but this man had proved himself capable of giving orders, and even to gag him would not help them if the captain of the yacht persisted in his obstinate course. Moreover, there was a distinct objection to promiscuous shooting. The prince felt that. There was no knowing how promiscuous shooting might end. "We will take the dinghy," said the prince quickly, to the captain. A bell rang below, and a sailor and a negro boy appeared on deck. The pulsations of the screw grew less rapid. The yacht stopped. The dinghy was lowered. As the prince and Nella prepared to descend into the little cockboat, Mr. Tom Jackson addressed Nella, all bound as he lay. "Good-bye," he said. "I shall see you again, never fear." In another moment they were in the dinghy, and the dinghy was adrift. The yacht's screw churned the water, and the beautiful vessel slipped away from them. As it receded, a figure appeared at the stern. It was Mr. Thomas Jackson. He had been released by his minions. He held a white handkerchief to his ear, and offered a calm, enigmatic smile to the two forlorn but victorious occupants of the dinghy. Jules had been defeated for once in his life. Or perhaps it would be more just to say that he had been outmaneuvered. Men like Jules are incapable of being defeated. It was characteristic of his luck that now, in the very hour when he had been caught red-handed in a serious crime against society, he should be effecting a leisurely escape, an escape which left no clue behind. The sea was utterly calm and blue in the morning sun. The dinghy rocked itself lazily in the swell of the yacht's departure. As the mist cleared away, the outline of the shore became more distinct, and it appeared as if Ostend was distant scarcely a cable's length. The white dome of the great Kursaal glittered in the pale turquoise sky, and the smoke of steamers in the harbour could be plainly distinguished. On the offing was a crowd of brown-sailed fishing luggers returning with the night's catch. The many-hued bathing vans could be counted on the distant beach. Everything seemed perfectly normal. It was difficult for either Nella or her companion to realize that anything extraordinary had happened within the last hour. Yet there was the yacht, not a mile off, to prove to them that something very extraordinary had in fact happened. The yacht was no vision, nor was that sinister watching figure at its stern a vision either. "I suppose Jules was too surprised and too feeble to inquire how I came to be on board his yacht," said the prince, taking the oars. "Oh, how did you?" asked Nella, her face lighting up. "Really, I'd almost forgotten that part of the affair." "I must begin at the beginning, and it will take some time," answered the prince. "Had we not better postpone the recital till we get ashore?" "I will row and you shall talk," said Nella. "I want to know now." He smiled happily at her, but gently declined to yield up the oars. "Is it not sufficient that I am here?" he said. "It is sufficient, yes," she replied. "But I want to know." With a long, easy stroke he was pulling the dinghy shorewards. She sat in the stern sheets. "There is no rudder," he remarked, "so you must direct me. Keep the boat's head on the lighthouse. The tide seems to be running in strongly. That will help us. The people on shore will think that we've only been for a little early morning excursion." "Will you kindly tell me how it came about that you were able to save my life, Prince?" she said. "Save your life, Miss Racksole? I didn't save your life. I merely knocked a man down." "You saved my life," she repeated. "That villain would have stopped at nothing. I saw it in his eye." "Then you were a brave woman, for you showed no fear of death." His admiring gaze rested full on her. For a moment the oars ceased to move. She gave a gesture of impatience. "It happened that I saw you last night in your carriage," he said. "The fact is, I had not had the audacity to go to Berlin with my story. I stopped in Ostend to see whether I could do a little detective work on my own account. It was a piece of good luck that I saw you. I followed the carriage as quickly as I could, and I just caught a glimpse of you as you entered that awful house. I knew that Jules had something to do with that house. I guessed what you were doing. I was afraid for you. Fortunately, I had surveyed the house pretty thoroughly. There is an entrance to it at the back, from a narrow lane. I made my way there. I got into the yard at the back, and I stood under the window of the room where you had the interview with Miss Spencer. I heard everything that was said. It was a courageous enterprise on your part to follow Miss Spencer from the Grand Babylon to Ostend. Well, I dared not force an entrance, lest I might precipitate matters too suddenly, and involve both of us in a difficulty. I merely kept watch. Ah, Miss Wraxall, you were magnificent with Miss Spencer. As I say, I could hear every word, for the window was slightly open. I felt that you needed no assistance from me. And then she cheated you with a trick, and the revolver came flying through the window. I picked it up. I thought it would probably be useful. There was a silence. I did not guess at first that you had fainted. I thought that you had escaped. When I found out the truth, it was too late for me to intervene. There were two men, both desperate, besides Miss Spencer. Who was the other man? Asked Nella. I do not know. It was dark. They drove away with you to the harbour. Again I followed. I saw them carry you on board. Before the yacht weighed anchor, I managed to climb unobserved into the dinghy. I lay down full length in it, and no one suspected that I was there. I think you know the rest. Was the yacht all ready for sea? The yacht was all ready for sea. The captain fellow was on the bridge, and steam was up. Then they expected me. How could that be? They expected someone. I do not think they expected you. Did the second man go on board? He helped to carry you along the gangway, but he came back again to the carriage. He was the driver. And no one else saw the business? The quay was deserted. You see, the last steamer had arrived for the night. There was a brief silence, and then Nella ejaculated under her breath, Truly, it is a wonderful world. And it was a wonderful world for them, though scarcely perhaps in the sense which Nella Wraxall had intended. They had just emerged from a highly disconcerting experience. Among other minor inconveniences, they had had no breakfast. They were out in the sea in a tiny boat. Neither of them knew what the day might bring forth. The man, at least, had the most serious anxieties for the safety of his royal nephew. And yet, neither of them wished that voyage of the little boat on the summer tide should come to an end. Each, perhaps unconsciously, had a vague desire that it might last forever, he lazily pulling, she directing his course at intervals by a movement of her distractingly pretty head. How was this condition of affairs to be explained? Well, they were both young, they both had superb health, and all the ardor of youth, and they were together.
Brian?
The boat was very small indeed. Her face was scarcely a yard from his.
Yeah.
She, in his eyes, surrounded by
What's
the
that?
glamour of beauty and vast wealth. He, in
Cool.
her eyes, surrounded by the glamour of masculine intrepidity and the brilliance of a throne. But all voyages come to an end, either at the shore or at the bottom of the sea, and at length the dinghy passed between the stone jetties of the harbour. The prince rowed to the nearest steps, tied up the boat, and they landed. It was 6 o'clock in the morning, and a day of gorgeous sunlight had opened. Few people were about at that early hour. And now, what next? Said the prince. I must take you to a hotel. I am in your hands, she acquiesced, with a smile which sent the blood racing through his veins. He perceived now that she was tired and overcome, suffering from a sudden and natural reaction. At the Hotel Wellington, the prince told the sleepy doorkeeper that they had come by the early train from Bruges and wanted breakfast at once. It was absurdly early, but a common English sovereign will work wonders in any Belgian hotel, and in a very brief time Nella and the prince were breakfasting on the veranda of the hotel upon chocolate that had been specially and hastily brewed for them. I never tasted such excellent chocolate, claimed the prince. The statement was wildly untrue, for the Hotel Wellington is not celebrated for its chocolate. Nevertheless, Nella replied enthusiastically, Nor I. Then there was a silence, and Nella, feeling possibly that she had been too ecstatic, remarked in a very matter-of-fact tone, I must telegraph to Papa instantly. Thus it was that Theodore Wraxall received the telegram which drew him away from Detective Marshall. Chapter 16. The Woman with the Red Hat. There's one thing, Prince, that we've just got to settle straight off, said Theodore Wraxall. They were all three seated, Wraxall, his daughter, and Prince Aribert, round a dinner table in a private room at the Hotel Wellington. Wraxall had duly arrived by the afternoon boat and had been met on the quay by the other two. They had dined early, and Raxel had heard the full story of the adventures by sea and land of Nella and the prince. As to his own adventure of the previous night, he said very little, merely explaining, with as little detail as possible, that Dimmock's body had come to light. "What is that?" asked the prince, in answer to Raxel's remark. "We've got to settle whether we shall tell the police at once all that has occurred, or whether we shall proceed on our own responsibility. There can be no doubt as to which course we ought to pursue. Every consideration of prudence points to the advisability of taking the police into our confidence, and leaving the matter entirely in their hands." "Oh, papa!" Nella burst out in her pouting, impulsive way. "You surely can't think of such a thing. Why, the fun has only just begun." "Do you call last night fun?" questioned Raxel, gazing at her solemnly. "Yes, I do," she said promptly. "Now?" "Well, I don't," was the millionaire's laconic response, but perhaps he was thinking of his own situation in the lift. "Do you not think we might investigate a little further?" said the prince judiciously, as he cracked a walnut. "Just a little further, and then, if we fail to accomplish anything, there would still be ample opportunity to consult the police." "How do you suggest we should begin?" asked Raxel. "Well, there is the house which Miss Raxel so intrepidly entered last evening." He gave her the homage of an admiring glance. "You and I, Mr Raxel, might examine that abode in detail." "Tonight?" "Certainly. We might do something." "We might do too much." "For example?" "We might shoot someone, or get ourselves mistaken for burglars. If we outstepped the law, it would be no excuse for us that we had been acting in a good cause." "True," said the prince. "Nevertheless—" He stopped. "Nevertheless, you have a distaste for bringing the police into the business. You want the hunt all to yourself. You are on fire with the ardor of the chase. Is not that it? Accept the advice of an older man, Prince, and sleep on this affair. I have little fancy for nocturnal escapades 2 nights together. As for you, Nella, off with you to bed. The Prince and I will have a yarn over such fluids as can be obtained in this hole." "Papa," she said, "you're perfectly horrid tonight." "Perhaps I am," he said. "Decidedly I am very cross with you for coming over here all alone. It was monstrous. If I didn't happen to be the most foolish of parents— There, good night. It's 9 o'clock. The Prince, I'm sure, will excuse you." If Nella had not really been very tired, Prince Aribert might have been the witness of a good-natured but stubborn conflict between the millionaire and his spirited offspring. As it was, Nella departed with surprising docility, and the 2 men were left alone. "Now," said Raxel suddenly, changing his tone, "I fancy that after all I am your man for a little amateur investigation tonight, and, if I must speak the exact truth, I think that to sleep on this affair would be about the very worst thing we could do. But I was anxious to keep Nella out of harm's way, at any rate till tomorrow. She is a very difficult creature to manage, Prince, and I may warn you," he laughed grimly, "that if we do succeed in doing anything tonight, we shall catch it from her ladyship in the morning. Are you ready to take that risk?" "I am," the Prince smiled, "but Miss Raxel is a young lady of quite remarkable nerve." "She is," said Raxel dryly. "I wish sometimes she had less." "I have the highest admiration for Miss Raxel," said the Prince, and he looked Miss Raxel's father full in the face. "You honour us, Prince," Raxel observed. "Let us come to business. Am I right in assuming that you have a reason for keeping the police out of this business, if it can possibly be done?" "Yes," said the Prince, and his brow clouded. "I am very much afraid that my poor nephew has involved himself in some scrape that he would wish not to be divulged." "Then you do not believe that he is the victim of foul play?" "I do not." "And the reason, if I may ask it?" "Mr Raxel, we speak in confidence, is it not so? Some years ago my foolish nephew had an affair with a feminine star of the Berlin stage. For anything I know, the lady may have been the very pattern of her sex, but where a reigning prince is concerned, scandal cannot be avoided in such a matter. I had thought that the affair was quite at an end, since my nephew's betrothal to Princess Anna of Eckstein-Schwarzburg is shortly to be announced. But yesterday I saw the lady to whom I have referred driving on the Digue. The coincidence of her presence here with my nephew's disappearance is too extraordinary to be disregarded." But how does this theory square with the murder of Reginald Dimmock? It does not square with it. My idea is that the murder of poor Dimmock and the disappearance of my nephew are entirely unconnected. Unless, indeed, this Berlin actress is playing into the hands of the murderers. I had not thought of that. Then what do you propose to do tonight? I propose to enter the house which Miss Rexel entered last night, and to find out something definite. I concur, said Rexel. I shall heartily enjoy it. But let me tell you, Prince, and pardon me for speaking bluntly, your surmise is incorrect. I would wager 100,000 pounds that Prince Eugen has been kidnapped. What grounds have you for being so sure? Ah, said Rexel, that's a long story. Let me begin by asking you this. Are you aware that your nephew, Prince Eugen, owes 1,000,000 of money? 1,000,000 of money? Cried Prince Aribert, astonished. It is impossible. Nevertheless, he does, said Rexel calmly. Then he told him all he had learned from Mr. Sampson Levi. What have you to say to that? Rexel ended. Prince Aribert made no reply. What have you to say to that? Rexel insisted. Merely that Eugen is ruined, even if he is alive. Not at all, Rexel returned with cheerfulness. Not at all. We shall see about that. The special thing that I want to know just now from you is this. Has any previous application ever been made for the hand of the Princess Anna? Yes, last year. The King of Bosnia sued for it, but his proposal was declined. Why? Because my nephew was considered to be a more suitable match for her. Not because the personal character of His Majesty of Bosnia is scarcely of the brightest. No. Unfortunately, it is usually impossible to consider questions of personal character when a royal match is concerned. Then, if for any reason the marriage of Princess Anna with your nephew was frustrated, the King of Bosnia would have a fair chance in that quarter. He would. The political aspect of things would be perfectly satisfactory. Thanks, said Rexel. I will wager another $100,000 that someone in Bosnia, I don't accuse the king himself, is at the bottom of this business. The methods of Balkan politicians have always been half Oriental. Let us go. Where? To this precious house of Nella's adventure. But surely it is too early. So it is, said Rexel, and we shall want a few things too. For instance, a dark lantern. I think I will go out and forage for a lantern. And a revolver, suggested Prince Aribert. Does it mean revolvers? The millionaire laughed. It may come to that. Here you are then, my friend, said Rexel, and he pulled one out of his hip pocket. And yours? I, said the prince, I have your daughters. The deuce you have, murmured Rexel to himself. It was then 9:30. They decided that it would be impolitic to begin their operations till after midnight. There were 3 hours to spare. Let us go and see the gambling, Rexel suggested. We might encounter the Berlin lady. The suggestion, in the first instance, was not made seriously, but it appeared to both men that they might do worse than spend the intervening time in the gorgeous saloon of the Kursaal, where, in the season, as much money is won and lost as at Monte Carlo. It was striking 10 o'clock as they entered the rooms. There was a large company present, a company which included some of the most notorious persons in Europe. In that multifarious assemblage all were equal. The electric light shone coldly and impartially on the just and on the unjust, on the fool and the knave, on the European and the Asiatic. As usual, women monopolized the best places at the tables. The scene was familiar enough to Prince Aribert, who had witnessed it frequently at Monaco, but Theodore Rexel had never before entered any European gaming palace. He had only the haziest idea of the rules of play, and he was at once interested. For some time they watched the play at the table which happened to be nearest to them. Rexel never moved his lips. With his eyes glued on the table and ears open for every remark of the players and the croupier, he took his first lesson in roulette. He saw a mere youth win 15,000 francs, which were stolen in the most barefaced manner by a rouged girl scarcely older than the youth. He saw 2 old gamesters stake their coins and lose and walk quietly out of the place. He saw the bank win 50,000 francs at a single turn. This is rather good fun, he said at length, but the stakes are too small to make it really exciting. I'll try my luck, just for the experience. I'm bound to win. Why? Asked the prince. Because I always do, in games of chance, Rexel answered with gay confidence. It is my fate. Then, tonight, you must remember, I shall be a beginner, and you know the tyro's luck. In 10 minutes, the croupier of that table was obliged to suspend operations pending the arrival of a further supply of coin. What did I tell you? Said Rexel, leading the way to another table further up the room. 100 curious glances went after him. One old woman, whose gay attire suggested a false youthfulness, begged him in French to stake a 5-franc piece for her. She offered him the coin. He took it and gave her a 100-franc note in exchange. She clutched the crisp, rustling paper and with hysterical haste scuttled back to her own table. At the second table there was a considerable air of excitement. In the forefront of the players was a woman in a low-cut evening dress of black silk and a large red picture hat. Her age appeared to be about 28. She had dark eyes, full lips, and a distinctly Jewish nose. She was handsome, but her beauty was of that forbidding, sinister order which is often called Junoesque. This woman was the center of attraction. People said to each other that she had won 160,000 francs that day at the table. "You're right," Prince Aribert whispered to Theodore Rexel. "That is the Berlin lady." "The deuce she is! Has she seen you? Will she know you?" "She would probably know me, but she hasn't looked up yet." "Keep behind her, then. I propose to find her a little occupation." By dint of a carefully exercised diplomacy, Rexel maneuvered himself into a seat opposite to the lady in the red hat. The fame of his success at the other table had followed him, and people regarded him as a serious and formidable player. In the first turn, the lady put 1,000 francs on 00. Rexel put 100 on number 19, and 1,000 on the odd numbers. 19 won. Rexel received 4,400 francs. 9 times in succession, Rexel backed number 19 in the odd numbers. 9 times the lady backed 00. 9 times Rexel won and the lady lost. The other players, perceiving that the affair had resolved itself into a duel, stood back for the most part and watched those two. Prince Aribert never stirred from his position behind the great red head. The game continued. Rexel lost trifles from time to time, but 99 hundredths of the luck was with him. As an English spectator at the table remarked, he couldn't do wrong. When midnight struck, the lady in the red hat was reduced to 1,000 francs. Then she fell into a winning vein for half an hour, but at 1 o'clock her resources were exhausted. Of the 160,000 francs which she was reputed to have had early in the evening, Rexel held about 90,000, and the bank had the rest. It was a calamity for the Juno of the red hat. She jumped up, stamped her foot, and hurried from the room. At a discreet distance, Rexel and the prince pursued her. "It might be well to ascertain her movements," said Rexel. Outside, in the glare of the great arc lights, and within sound of the surf which beats always at the very foot of the Kursaal, the Juno of the red hat summoned a fiacre and drove rapidly away. Rexel and the prince took an open carriage and started in pursuit. They had not, however, travelled more than half a mile when Prince Aribert stopped the carriage and, bidding Rexel get out, paid the driver and dismissed him. "I feel sure I know where she's going," he explained, "and it would be better for us to follow on foot." "You mean she's making for the scene of the last night's affair?" said Rexel. "Exactly. We shall, what you call, kill 2 birds with 1 stone." Prince Aribert's guess was correct. The lady's carriage stopped in front of the house where Nella Rexel and Miss Spencer had had their interview on the previous evening, and the lady vanished into the building just as the 2 men appeared at the end of the street. Instead of proceeding along that street, the prince led Rexel to the lane which gave on to the backs of the houses, and he counted the houses as they went up the lane. In a few minutes they had burglariously climbed over a wall and crept, with infinite caution, up a long, narrow piece of ground, half garden, half paved yard, till they crouched under a window which was shielded by curtains, but which had been left open a little. "Listen," said the prince in his lightest whisper. "They're talking." "Who?" "The Berlin lady and Miss Spencer. I'm sure it's Miss Spencer's voice." Rexel boldly pushed the French window a little wider open and put his ear to the aperture, through which came a beam of yellow light. "Take my place," he whispered to the prince. "They're talking German. You'll understand better." Silently they exchanged places under the window, and the prince listened intently. Then you refuse, Miss Spencer's visitor was saying. There was no answer from Miss Spencer. Not even 1,000 francs? I tell you, I've lost the whole 25,000. Again, no answer. Then I'll tell the whole story, the lady went on, in an angry rush of words. I did what I promised to do. I enticed him here, and you've got him safe in your vile cellar, poor little man, and you won't give me a paltry 1,000 francs? You've already had your price. The words were Miss Spencer's. They fell cold and calm on the night air. I want another 1,000. I haven't it. Then we'll see. Prince Aribert heard a rustle of flying skirts, then another movement. A door banged, and the beam of light through the aperture of the window suddenly disappeared. He pushed the window wide open. The room was in darkness and apparently empty. Now that lantern of yours, he said eagerly to Theodore Rexall, after he had translated to him the conversation of the two women. Rexall produced the dark lantern from the capacious pocket of his dust coat and lighted it. The ray flashed about the ground. "What is it?" exclaimed Prince Aribert with a swift cry, pointing to the ground. The lantern threw its light on a perpendicular grating at their feet, through which could be discerned a cellar. They both knelt down and peered into the subterranean chamber. On a broken chair, a young man sat listlessly, with closed eyes, his head leaning heavily forward on his chest. In the feeble light of the lantern, he had the livid and ghastly appearance of a corpse. "Who can it be?" said Rexall. "It is Eugen," was the prince's low answer. End of chapter 16.
So she got abducted. Oh, hey there, Crazy Eyes. Can you hear me?
You're very quiet.
I'm really... Whoa, sorry.
Oh, there it goes.
As I turned my mic up way too loud.
A little louder wouldn't hurt, actually.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you could stand to turn your microphone up more, but I can't hear you now.
Better?
Yes.
Okay. I'm in Sea of Thieves, but I'm playing with some rando. But I'm not much better than he is, so I don't know what to say about that. I'm playing with him.
You should bail on the rando and play with me instead.
Okay, let me put this gemstone onto his boat, and then I'll quit and get you to help me figure out how to join you. So this is my friend Crazy Eyes that I was talking about, and
You want to send me a friend request through the Xbox app, and then you should be able to join on me.
okay, I'll figure that out in a minute. I don't know how to do that.
Is your Xbox or Windows account also Karothkin?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll see if I can find you.
I really wish I could have communicated to him that I was going to bail on him, but oh well.
Chapter 17 and 18.
I'm gonna assume that listening to me and Crazy Eyes is a little bit more interesting than the story for this moment, which could be a huge oversight on my part, but I'm going to make that assumption, and now I'm hoping I'm not blowing people's ears out with my mic volume. Or maybe the microphone is perfect now and it wasn't before. Either way, I don't know how to skip this sequence. It's gonna play through. It's gonna have to. Never mind, the escape button works. Yes, fair viewer, I am Krothkin. Oh, you guys can't actually see any of this stuff I'm doing.
Just sent you an invite.
He sent me an invite. Oh, everyone heard that, actually. Crazy guys. Yes. Cool, you know what you're doing and I don't. So because of watching you before, I am not bad at doing sales, and that's about it. I don't know how to do anything else besides drop and pull anchor and set sail. I don't even know how to get missions, or if it's advantageous to.
Yeah, it definitely is. Especially right now, there's a double golden rewards weekend going on.
Well, score. Now I'm gonna actually begin the story again, or continue the story.
Grand
Still
Babylon
seems very
Hotel.
cool.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information as a volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. The Grand Babylon Hotel by Arnold Bennett. Chapter 17. The Release of Prince Eugen.
Okay, so,
Eugen, Prince Erbert called softly. At the sound of his own name, the young man in the cellar feebly raised his head and stared up at the grating which separated him from his two
so
rescuers.
there's three main factions
showed
that you
no
may know
recognition.
about. The Gold Hoarders, the Order of Souls, and the Merchant Alliance. They all have like their little hubs on all the outposts. The merchants are always by the dock, right here where you're going to park your ship. They give you quests like hunting around islands for certain types of animals that you cage up and return to them, or they'll give you supplies that you need to deliver to an NPC on an island, or they'll have you searching for a sunken ship that had returning the charter log to them.
Do we want to go towards the skull and I can try to see if I can survive?
We could do that, yeah. The skull is a skull fort. That's the thing I was trying to show you last time that the cannon sent me. It's just a bunch of waves of skeletons with treasure at the end, basically. Gold hoarders are buried treasure and what's the other one? Buried treasure and gold vaults. So you'll either get a treasure map or like a riddle on an island that you have to follow the clues to figure out where the treasure is buried.
So do I grab a Gold Fort mission?
No, the Skull Fort is just one of the emergent events that pops up. That's that skull cloud. Anyone can go do it at any time, and the whole server can see that skull cloud. So, when we first join, it's usually a good idea to hop on the ship and check the map here. You can interact with the map table, moving around in Zoom with the mouse wheel and cursor. And what this will show you is, if you just scan around really quick, so we can see this little red skull icon here. That is a Reaper's chest. So it's not particularly valuable, but everyone on the server can see where that is. So if we wanted to go for it, we could scoop it up and return it to Reapers here for a little bit. This one's worth doubloons, but everyone could see that we had it. Other than that, I'm not seeing any other ships on the map, so that means nobody's running the Reaper's Emissary flag. So no one is announcing that they're out for blood right now. Which means that it's probably a little bit safer for us to go do the Skull Fort. We don't have to worry as much about someone rolling up on us and sinking us.
Let's give it a shot.
So before we head out, we want to go to all the barrels that we can and pull all the supplies out of them and load them onto the ship. So all these barrels along the pier here, there's a bunch of barrels in the tavern. We don't have to do it. We don't have to take everything off the island, but it's good to give yourself a little boost starting out.
Boost. Sorry.
He gazed in an aimless, vague, silly manner for a few seconds, his eyes blinking under the glare of the lantern, and then his head slowly drooped again onto his chest. He was dressed in a dark tweed travelling suit, and Rexel observed that one sleeve, the left, was torn across the upper part of the cuff, and that there were stains of dirt on the left shoulder. The soiled linen collar, which had lost all its starch and was half unbuttoned, partially encircled the captor's neck. His brown boots were unlaced. A cap, a handkerchief, a portion of a watch chain, and a few gold coins lay on the floor. Rexel flashed the lantern into the corners of the cellar, but he could discover no other furniture except the chair on which the hereditary Prince of Posen sat, and a small deal table on which were a plate and a cup. "Eugen!" cried Prince Erebert once more, but this time his forlorn nephew made no response whatever, and then Erebert added in a low voice to Rexel, "Perhaps he cannot see us clearly." "But he must surely recognize your voice," said Rexel, in a hard, gloomy tone. There was a pause, and the two men above ground looked at each other hesitatingly. Each knew that they must enter that cellar and get Prince Eugen out of it, and each was somehow afraid to take the next step. "Thank God he's not dead."
I wonder if I took the drum.
"He may be worse than dead," Rexel replied. "Worse than? What do you mean?" "I mean, he may be mad." "Come," Erebert almost shouted, with a sudden access of energy, a wild impulse for action, and, snatching the lantern from Rexel, he rushed into the dark room where they had heard the conversation of Miss Spencer and the lady in the red hat. For a moment Rexel did not stir from the threshold of the window. "Come," Prince Erebert repeated, and there was an imperious command in his utterance. "What are you afraid of?" "I don't know," said Rexel, feeling stupid and queer. "I don't know." Then he marched heavily after Prince Erebert into the room. On the mantelpiece were a couple of candles which had been blown
This
out,
was the wrong
and in a
way.
mechanical, unthinking way Rexel lighted them, and the two men glanced round the room. It presented no peculiar features. It was just an ordinary room, rather small, rather mean, rather shabby, with an ugly wallpaper and ugly pictures in ugly frames. Thrown over a chair was a man's evening dress jacket. The door was closed. Prince Erebert turned the knob, but he could not open it. "It's locked," he said. "Evidently they know we're here." "Nonsense," said Rexel brusquely. "How can they know?" And taking hold of the knob, he violently shook the door, and it opened. "I told you it wasn't locked," he added, and this small success of opening the door seemed to steady the man. It was a curious psychological effect, this terrorizing, for it amounted to that, of two courageous full-grown men by the mere apparition of a helpless creature in a cellar. Gradually, they both recovered from it. The next moment, they were out in the passage, which led to the front door of the house. The front door stood open. They looked into the street, up and down, but there was not a soul in sight.
Supermarkets are full. You
The
can
street,
come
lighted
and
by
stuff
3
on the
gas
ship.
lamps only, seemed strangely sinister and mysterious.
The red barrels here
She's gone, that's
where
clear,
cannonballs or
Rexel,
grenades go.
meaning-
I like to keep cannonballs up top and grenades on the bottom.
And then below deck you put your food and your...
Yep, there's just the one barrel for planks. And then I like to keep like any edible food up top and then worms on the bottom. That way you can quickly open up the food barrel, just grab anything, and be confident that it's actually going to be food.
Are we ready to set sail?
As soon as I purify the ship.
Wait, what are you doing?
I'm decorating the ship.
Ah. He doesn't like his ships vanilla.
Theme in mind, I'm just going to toss on some cosmetics and see how it goes.
Do it. I'm gonna light the torches so we look like noobs.
But we won't with this cat.
Just kidding. He's the guy that taught me to
Okay.
douse the torches so then people can't see you as easy. Because if you have the torches on, people can see you really easy. But if you have the torches off, they can't, so...
So, we need to raise the anchor. Drop the sails and start sailing us towards that cloud.
The woman with the red hat. And Miss Spencer after her, do you think? Questioned Erebert. No, she would stay. She would never dare to leave. Let us find the cellar steps. The cellar steps were happily not difficult to discover, for in moving a pace backwards, Prince Erebert had a narrow escape of precipitating himself to the bottom of them. The lantern showed that they were built on a curve. Silently, Raxel resumed possession of the lantern and went first, the prince close behind him. At the foot was a short passage, and in this passage crouched the figure of a woman. Her eyes threw back the rays of the lantern, shining like a cat's at midnight. Then, as the men went nearer,
Keep
they
making
saw that
that
it was Miss
mistake.
Spencer who barred their way. She seemed half to kneel on the stone floor, and in one hand she held what at first appeared to be a dagger, but which proved to be nothing more romantic than a rather long bread knife. "I hurt you! I hurt you!" she exclaimed.
So the map
Get back.
updates with our
You
position
mustn't come
live,
here.
so we can
There was a desperate
see
and
where
dangerous
we're
look on her
sailing.
face, and her form shook with scarcely controlled passionate energy.
Did we miss
"Now
the skull?
see here, Miss Spencer," Raxel said calmly. "I guess we've had enough of this fandango.
It's over there.
You'd better get up and clear out.
Oh, okay.
I just have to drag you off." He went calmly up to her, the lantern in his hand. Without another word, she struck the knife into his arm, and the lantern
Fell
fell extinguished.
downstairs.
Raxel gave a cry,
I'm
rather of
guessing
angry
it's a
surprise
crack
than
in
of
the
pain,
watchtower.
and retreated a few steps.
So we're probably not
In the
that
darkness,
far.
they could still
We'll
perceive
find
the
out.
glint of her eyes. "I
If
told you,
you're
you
asleep,
mustn't
you
come
can
here,"
look
the
over
woman
the back
said.
railing
"Now
here and
get
see the
back."
map table below.
Raxel positively laughed. It was a queer laugh, but he laughed, and he could not help it. The idea of this woman, this bureau clerk, stopping his progress and that of Prince Erebert by means of a bread knife, aroused his sense of humor. He struck a match, relighted the candle, and faced Miss Spencer once more.
We may have a ship
"I'll
in
do it again,"
distance.
she said, with a note of hard resolve. "Oh, no, you won't, my girl," said Raxel, and he pulled out his revolver, cocked it, raised his hand. "Put
Yeah,
down that
we do. I
plaything I shall shoot. She pressed her lips together. I shall shoot, he repeated. 1, 2, 3. Bang, bang.
You see the sort
He
of
had
dark
fired
silhouette?
twice, purposely missing her.
I do.
Miss Spencer never blenched. Rexel was tremendously
I
surprised,
can't tell
and he
if
would
it's
have been
a
a
brig or
thousandfold
a
more
galleon.
surprised
It's
could he have
definitely bigger
contrasted
than
her
us.
behavior now with her abject terror on the
That said, it
previous
should be safe
evening
enough
when
to just
Nella
kind of
had
sail
threatened
by
her.
and see what's up.
You've got a bit of pluck, he said, but it won't help you.
Or they'll sink
Why
us.
won't you let us pass? As a matter of fact, pluck was just what she had not, really. She had merely subordinated one terror to another. She was desperately afraid of Rexel's revolver, but she was much more afraid of something else. Why won't you let us pass? I daren't, she said, with a plaintive tremor. Tom put me in charge. That was all. The man could see tears running down her poor, wrinkled face. Theodore Rexel began to take off his light overcoat. I see I must take my coat off to you, he said, and he almost smiled. Then, with a quick movement, he threw the coat over Miss Spencer's head and flew at her, seizing both her arms, while Prince Aribert assisted. Her struggles ceased. She was beaten. That's all right, said Rexel. I could never have used that revolver, to mean business with, of course. They carried her, unresisting, upstairs, and on to the upper floor, where they locked her in a bedroom. She lay in the bed, as if exhausted. Now for my poor Eugen, said Prince Aribert. Don't you think we'd better search the house first? Rexel suggested. It will be safer to know just how we stand. We can't afford any ambushes, or things of that kind, you know. The prince agreed, and they searched the house from top to bottom, but found no one. Then, having locked the front door and the French window of the sitting room, they proceeded again to the cellar. Here, a new obstacle confronted them. The cellar door was, of course, locked. There was no sign of a key.
Dagger tooth outpost.
They were compelled to return to the bedroom where Miss Spencer was incarcerated in order to demand the key of the cellar from her. She still lay without movement on the bed. Tom's got it, she replied, faintly, to their question. Tom's got it, I swear to you. He took it for safety. Then how do you feed your prisoner? Rexel asked sharply. Through the grating, she answered. Both men shuddered. They felt she was speaking the truth. For the third time they went to the cellar door. In vain Rexel thrust
So I'm
himself
trying to
against
keep
it.
the
He could do
island
no more than
between
shake
us
it.
and them as much as
Let's try
possible.
both together, said Prince
So
Aribert.
that hopefully if
Now.
there's anybody on their ship,
There was a
they'll
crack.
notice us right away.
Again, said Prince Aribert. There was another crack, and then
This is
the
also
upper
why we
hinge
don't
gave
know
away.
if the flare turns
The
on.
rest was easy. Over the wreck of the door, they entered Prince Eugen's prison. The captive still sat on his chair. The terrific noise and bustle of breaking down the door seemed not to have aroused him from his lethargy, but when Prince Aribert spoke to him in German, he looked at his uncle. Will you not come with us, Eugen? Said Prince Aribert. You needn't stay here any longer, you know. Leave me alone, was the strange reply.
That
Leave
looks
me
like
alone.
a
What do you
brig,
want? We're here to get you out of this
Which is
scrape,
the
said
three-player
Aribert
ship.
gently. Rexel stood aside. Who's that fellow?
Attacking
Eugen
would almost
sharply.
certainly go bad for
That
us.
is my friend,
so
Mr.
unless you
Rexel,
just want to have
an
fun
Englishman, or
get some
rather, I
practice
should
on
say,
cannons
an
and then
American,
sink,
to whom we owe a great deal.
probably just sail on
Come and have
past.
supper, Eugen.
Let's sail on
I
past.
won't, answered Eugen doggedly. I'm waiting here for her. You didn't think anyone had kept me here, did you, against my will? I tell you, I'm waiting for her. She said she'd come. Who is she? Aribert
It
asked,
said their parts
humouring
with
him.
their anchor down and sails down, so they're
Why,
very good.
you know. I forgot,
Still
of
not
course.
trying to pick
You
a
don't
fight,
know. You mustn't ask. Don't pry, Uncle Aribert. She was wearing a red hat. I'll take you to her, my dear Eugen. Prince Aribert put his hands on the other's shoulder, but Eugen shook him off violently, stood up, and then sat down again. Aribert looked at Rexel, and they both looked at Prince Eugen. The latter's face was flushed, and Rexel observed that the left pupil was more dilated than the right. The man started,
Oh, no, that's okay,
muttered
I'll
odd,
get-
fragmentary
never mind.
scraps of sentences, now grumbling,
Definitely
now
don't want
whining.
any of that.
His mind is unhinged, Rexel whispered in English. Hush, said Prince Aribert. He understands English. But Prince Eugen took no notice of the brief colloquy. We'd better get him upstairs, somehow, said Rexel. Yes, Aribert assented. Eugen, the lady with the red hat, the lady you're waiting for, is upstairs. She sent us down to ask you to come up. Won't you come? Himmel, the poor fellow exclaimed, with a kind of weak anger. Why did you not say this before? He rose, staggered towards
Where's
Aribert,
my
and
bucket?
fell headlong on the floor. He had swooned. The two men raised him, carried him up the stone steps, and laid him with infinite care on a sofa. He lay, breathing queerly through the nostrils, his eyes closed.
Were they shooting at us or just the fort?
Every now and then, a convulsion ran through his frame. "One of us must fetch a doctor," said
Their sails didn't move at all, so
"I will," said Rexel. At that moment, there was a quick curt rap on the French window, and both Rexel and the prince glanced round startled. A girl's face was pressed against the large window pane. It was Nella's. Rexel unfastened the
We only got hit the 2 times, right?
"I have found you," she said lightly.
I think so.
Okay, because I patched both holes.
I couldn't sleep. I inquired
You
from the
noticed
hotel
water filling up
clerks
the
if you
ship.
had
That
retired,
means we missed
and they
one.
said no. So I slipped out.
I got the water
I guessed
out.
you were. Rexel interrupted her with a question as to what she meant by this escapade, but she stopped him with a careless gesture. "What's this?" She pointed to the form on the sofa. "That is my nephew, Prince Eugen," said Herbert. "Hurt?" she inquired coldly. "I hope not." "He is ill," said Rexel. "His brain is turned." Nella began to examine the unconscious prince with the expert movement of a girl who had passed through the best hospital course to be obtained in
So
New York.
let's see.
"He has got
That's
brain
not an
fever,"
option.
she
We can
said.
hit him
"That is all,
post.
but it
Yeah,
will be enough.
Sanctuary. We'll
Do
pick
you
up
know
the
if there is
voyage
a
and
bed
do that
anywhere in
instead.
this remarkable house?" Chapter 18. In the night time. "He must on no account be moved," said the dark little Belgian doctor, whose eyes seemed to peer so quizzically through his spectacles, and he said it with much positiveness. That pronouncement rather settled their plans for them. It was certainly a professional triumph for Nella, who, previous to the doctor's arrival, had told them the very
West
same
for
thing.
this.
Considerable argument had passed before the doctor was sent for. Prince Herbert was for keeping the whole affair a deep secret among their 3 selves. Theodore Rexel agreed so far, but he suggested further that at no matter what risk they should transport the patient over to England at once. Rexel had an idea that he should feel safer in that hotel of his, and better able to deal with any situation that might arise. Nella scorned the idea. In her quality of an amateur nurse, she assured them that Prince Eugen was much more seriously ill than either of them suspected, and she urged that they should take absolute possession of the house, and keep possession till Prince Eugen was convalescent. "But what about the Spencer female?" Rexel had said. "Keep her where she is. Keep her a prisoner, and hold the house against all comers. If Jules should come back, simply defy him to enter. That is all. There are 2 of you, so you must keep an eye on the former occupiers if they return, and on Miss Spencer, while I nurse the patient. But first, you must send for a doctor." "Doctor?" Prince Herbert had said, alarmed. "Will it not be necessary to make some awkward explanation to the doctor?" "Not at all," she replied. "Why should it be? In a place like Ostend, doctors are far too discreet to ask questions. They see too much to retain their curiosity. Besides, do you want your nephew to die?" Both the men were somewhat taken aback by the girl's sagacious grasp of the situation, and it came about that they began to obey her like subordinates. She told her father to sally forth in search of a doctor, and he went. She gave Prince Herbert certain other orders, and he promptly executed them. By the evening of the following day, everything was going smoothly. The doctor came and departed several times, and sent medicine, and seemed fairly optimistic as to the issue of the illness. An old woman had been induced to come in and cook and clean. Miss Spencer was kept out of sight on the attic floor, pending some decision as to what to do with her, and no one outside the house had asked any questions. The inhabitants of that particular street must have been accustomed to strange behavior on the part of their neighbors, unaccountable appearances and disappearances, strange flittings and arrivals. This strong-minded and active trio, Rexel, Nella, and Prince Herbert, might have been the lawful and accustomed tenants of the house, for any outward evidence to the contrary. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Prince Eugen was distinctly and seriously worse. Nella had sat up with him the previous night and throughout the day. Her father had spent the morning at the hotel, and Prince Herbert had kept watch. The 2 men were never absent from the house at the same time, and one of them always did duty as sentinel at night. On this afternoon, Prince Herbert and Nella sat together in the patient's bedroom. The doctor had just left. Theodore Rexel was downstairs, reading the New York Herald. The prince and Nella were near the window, which looked onto the back garden. It was a queer, shabby little bedroom to shelter the august body of a European personage like Prince Eugen of Posen. Curiously enough, both Nella and her father, ardent democrats though they were, had been somehow impressed by the royalty and importance of the fever-stricken prince, impressed as they had never been by Herbert. They both felt that here, under their care, was a species of individuality quite new to them, and different from anything they had previously encountered. Even the gestures and tones of his delirium had an air of abrupt yet condescending command, an imposing mixture of suavity and haughtiness. As for Nella, she had been first struck by the beautiful E over a crown on the sleeves of his linen, and by the signet ring on his pale, emaciated hand. After all, these trifling outward signs are at least as effective as others of deeper but less obtrusive significance. The Wrexells, too, duly marked the attitude of Prince Aribert to his nephew. It was at once paternal and reverential. It disclosed clearly that Prince Aribert continued, in spite of everything, to regard his nephew as his sovereign lord and master, as a being surrounded by a natural and inevitable pomp and awe. This attitude, at the beginning, seemed false and unreal to the Americans. It seemed to them to be assumed, but gradually they came to perceive that they were mistaken, and that though America might have cast out the monarchical superstition, nevertheless that superstition had vigorously survived in another part of the world. You and Mr. Wrexell have been extraordinarily kind to me, said Prince Aribert very quietly, after the two had sat some time in silence. Why? How? She asked unaffectedly. We are interested in this affair ourselves, you know. It began at our hotel. You mustn't forget that, Prince. I don't, he said. I forget nothing. But I cannot help feeling that I have led you into a strange entanglement. Why should you and Mr. Wrexell be here? You who are supposed to be on a holiday, hiding in a strange house in a foreign country, subject to all sorts of annoyances and all sorts of risks, simply because I am anxious to avoid scandal, to avoid any sort of talk in connection with my misguided nephew. It is nothing to you that the hereditary Prince of Posen should be liable to a public disgrace. What will it matter to you if the throne of Posen becomes the laughing-stock of Europe? I really don't know, Prince, Nella smiled roguishly. But we Americans have a habit of going right through with anything we've begun. Ah, he said, who knows how this thing will end? All our trouble, our anxieties, our watchfulness may come to nothing. I tell you that when I see Eugen lying there and think that we cannot learn his story until he recovers, I'm ready to go mad. We might be arranging things, making matters smooth, preparing for the future, if only we knew what he can tell us. I tell you that I'm ready to go mad. If anything should happen to you, Miss Wrexell, I would kill myself. But why? She questioned. Supposing, that is, that anything could happen to me, which it can't. Because I have dragged you into this, he replied, gazing at her. It is nothing to you. You are only being kind. How do you know it is nothing to me, Prince? She asked him quickly. Just then, the sick man made a convulsive movement, and Nella flew to the bed and soothed him. From the head of the bed, she looked over at Prince Aribert, and he returned her bright, excited glance. She was in her travelling frock, with a large white Belgian apron tied over it. Large dark circles of fatigue and sleeplessness surrounded her eyes, and to the prince her cheeks seemed hollow and thin. Her hair lay thick over the temples.
Skeletons or buried treasure?
Skeletons and buried treasure?
Yeah, you just pick up, so you want to talk to the lady in here, grab a mission from her, and same with the dude in the tent.
Do I want to pick up all three of the things she's talking about?
I think you only have room for 3 voyages in your inventory. So 1 or 2
Okay, cool. Now I've got 3 voyages.
Okay.
Do we want to grab stuff from barrels while we're around?
Yeah, may as well. I'll grab some stuff from the tavern if you want to loot the dock.
Half covering the ears, Erebert gave no answer to her query, merely gazed at her with melancholy intensity. "I think I will go and rest," she said at last. "You will know all about the medicine." "Sleep well," he said, as he softly opened the door for her. And then he was alone with Eugen. It was his turn that night to watch, for they still half expected some strange, sudden visit, or onslaught, or move of one kind or another from Jules. Raxel slept in the parlour on the ground floor. Nella had the front bedroom on the first floor. Miss Spencer was immured in the attic. The last-named lady had been singularly quiet and incurious, taking her food from Nella and asking no questions. The old woman went at night to her own abode in the purlieus of the harbour. Hour after hour Erebert sat silent by his nephew's bedside, attending mechanically to his wants, and every now and then gazing hard into the vacant, anguished face, as if trying to extort from that mask the secrets which it held. Erebert was tortured by the idea that if he could have only half an hour's, only a quarter of an hour's rational speech with Prince Eugen, all might be cleared up and put right, and by the fact that that rational talk was absolutely impossible on Eugen's part until the fever had run its course. As the minutes crept on to midnight, the watcher, made nervous by the intense, electrical atmosphere which seems always to surround a person who is dangerously ill, grew more and more a prey to vague and terrible apprehensions. His mind dwelt hysterically
Thanks for
on the
that.
most fatal possibilities.
No problem.
He wondered what would occur if by any ill chance Eugen should die in that bed. How he would explain the affair to Posen and to the Emperor. How he would justify himself. He saw himself being tried for murder, sentenced. Him,
So,
a
now
prince of
you've
the
got
blood.
voyages, we'll want to come down here to the voyage table. Interact with this table. Over here. That's the map table. Did you eat worms?
I did. I didn't know what to do with them.
They go in the lower food barrel. Can't seem to vote for your quest.
Oh, because I have to vote for it first, probably.
There we go.
That makes sense.
So now, a document has been added to your quest wheel. Which I believe I have a lot of the default keys changed, but I think if you hold Q and then hit space, it brings up the radial menu with all your quests in it. There should be one that looks like a skull. Left click to hold it up, and it'll tell you which island we're going to. You can right click to hold things out for other people to read. Do you see it? Do you see it?
I can see it, but I don't understand what island we're going to.
It says recently sighted at Lonely Isle. So we have to find Lonely Isle on the map, which should be pretty close by. I happen to know it's one of the larger ones. Much more north.
Gotcha. Okay.
And you can left click to circle things on the map if you want.
Cool.
So, we have to head southeast to Lonely Island, where we will find a bunch of skeletons that we fight, kill that skeleton captain, and bring the skull back to get our reward.
Led to the scaffold, a scene unparalleled in Europe for over a century. Then he gazed anew at the sick man, and thought he saw death in every drawn feature of that agonized face. He could have screamed aloud. His ears heard a peculiar resonant boom. He started. It was nothing but the city clock striking 12. But there was another sound, a mysterious shuffle at the door. He listened, then jumped from his chair. Nothing now, nothing. But still he felt drawn to the door, and after what seemed an interminable interval, he went and opened it, his heart beating furiously. Nella lay in a heap on the doormat. She was fully dressed, but had apparently lost consciousness. He clutched at her slender body, picked her up, carried her to the chair by the fireplace, and laid her in it. He had forgotten all about Eugene. "What is it, my angel?" he whispered. And then he kissed her twice. He could only look at her. He did not know what to do to succor her. At last she opened her eyes and sighed. "Where am I?" she asked, vaguely, in a tremulous tone, as she recognized him. "Is it you? Did I do anything silly? Did I faint? What has happened? Were you ill?" he questioned anxiously. He was kneeling at her feet, holding her hand tight. "I saw Jules by the side of my bed," she murmured. "I'm sure I saw him. He laughed at me. I had not undressed. I sprang up, frightened, but he had gone, and then I ran downstairs, to you." "You were dreaming," he soothed her. "Was I?" "You must have been. I've not heard a sound. No one could have entered. But if you like, I will wake Mr. Wraxall."
Yeah, this will be it.
"Perhaps I was dreaming," she admitted. "How foolish." "You were overtired," he said, still unconsciously holding her hand. They gazed at each other. She smiled at him. "You kissed me," she said suddenly, and he blushed red and stood up before her. "Why did you kiss me?" "Ah, Miss Wraxall," he murmured, hurrying the words out. "Forgive me. It is unforgivable, but forgive me. I was overpowered by my feelings. I did not know what I was doing." "Why did you kiss me?" she repeated. "Because, Nella, I love you. I have no right to say it." "Why have you no right to say it?" "If Eugen dies, I shall owe a duty to Posen. I shall be its ruler." "Well," she said calmly, with an adorable confidence, "Papa is worth 40 millions. Would you not abdicate?" "Ah," he gave a low cry. "Will you force me to say these things? I could not shirk my duty to Posen, and the reigning Prince of Posen can only marry a princess." "But Prince Eugen will live," she said positively. "And if he lives—" "Then I shall be free. I would renounce all my rights to make you mine if... "If what, Prince?" "If you would deign to accept my hand." "Am I, then, rich enough?"
So, hit things with your sword, shoot them with
"Nella."
your gun.
He bent down to her. Then there was a crash of breaking glass. Aribert went to the window and opened it. In the starlit gloom he could see that a ladder had been raised against the back of the house. He thought he heard footsteps at the end of the garden. "It was Jules,"
I know I
he
stole the
exclaimed to
closer
Nella,
ones, but
and
it
without
wasn't bad
another
that I
word
got 2 for
rushed
2.
upstairs to the attic. The attic was empty. Miss Spencer had mysteriously vanished. End of chapter 17 and 18.
Incoming.
The idea of a skeleton eating something to stay alive was rather amusing.
They do like their bananas.
I can't see the ladder. Thank you.
X by default to drop things.
Do we want to see if there's more on that island to get in the barrels?
Yeah, we can check.
Oh no, what chapter did I just complete?
Do you know how to sword launch yet?
17 and 18.
Chapter 19 and 20 of the Grand Babylon Hotel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit.
So hold block to start out with so that you can move around. Then, while still holding block, hold left click to charge a dash. And then sometime after you release, you can jump. And your momentum will still carry you forward. Great for like if you're jumping off of something to get a lot of distance, or if you go into the water, you'll keep your momentum so you'll move a long ways.
Just trying to time it
It's a
right.
little tricky to nail, but once you get it, it's like the best way to travel.
Use sword techniques to travel. Oh hey, I did it.
Nice.
Took me 4 tries, but still.
LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. The Grand Babylon Hotel by Arnold Bennett. Chapter 19. Royalty at the Grand Babylon.
So, like these snakes,
The
for
royal
example,
apartments at the
kinds of
Grand
things
Babylon
that we'd
are
be
famous
looking
in the
for
world of
when doing
hotels,
missions,
and indeed
they'll
elsewhere,
find
as being, in their own way,
insects or
unsurpassed. Some of the
grab
palaces of
cages
Germany,
and
and in particular those of the mad Ludwig of Bavaria, may possess rooms and saloons which outshine them in gorgeous luxury and a mere wild fairy-like extravagance of wealth. But there is nothing, anywhere, even on 8th Avenue in New York, which can fairly be called more complete, more perfect, more enticing, or not least
Is it valuable for anything other than destroying enemy boats?
Not really. It's worth like 100 or so gold to the merchants, but it's dangerous enough to have it on your ship that it's generally not worth it. But if we're going to sail straight back towards the outpost, we can cash it in.
Let's do it. Legitimately took
more
me a minute to
comfortable.
decide.
The suite consists of 6
Putting these on the ship is to bring them up to the crow's nest and leave them up there. That way, if they explode, they won't do a ton of damage to the hull.
chambers: the anteroom, the saloon or audience chamber, the dining room, the yellow drawing room, where royalty receives its friends, the library, and the state bedroom, to the last of which we have already been introduced. The most important and most impressive of these is, of course, the audience chamber, an apartment 50 feet long by 40 feet broad, with a superb outlook over the Thames, the shot tower, and the higher signals of the South-Western Railway. The decoration of this room is mainly in the German taste, since 4 out of every 6 of its royal occupants are of Teutonic blood, but its chief glory is its French ceiling, a masterpiece by Fragonard, taken bodily.
You can tell which islands they are because they have all the red lights. You can tell from a distance by looking over there. That's going to be our outpost. But there's a skeleton sloop dead ahead. So if you wanted to practice on the cannons and earn a little bit of treasure while you're at it, we could head for that thing.
Yes.
And since it's not a player, it's probably not smart enough to try and blow up our powder keg.
Is it the one in the direction that I pointed, or is it...
Yeah, it's the ship in the horizon with all the glowy lights on it.
Let's do it.
Alright, so grab an inventory of cannonballs, get your cannons loaded. Chain shot isn't any good against these ships because their mast can't go down. But make sure you've got cannonballs, food, and planks on you.
Hate the motorcycles. Okay, both cannons are loaded.
Okay, make sure you've got food and planks on you so that if you need to heal real quick, you can. I can worry about sailing and keeping the ship afloat if you just want to focus on like aiming and laying some damage on them.
Sure.
It should be fine. These things aren't that much of a threat. At most, I'll have to get you to help me bail if we take too much damage.
Leap from a certain famous palace on the Loire. The walls are of panelled oak, with an 8-foot dado of Arak cloth imitated from unique continental examples. The carpet, woven in one piece, is an antique specimen of the finest Turkish work, and it was obtained, a bargain, by Felix Babylon from an impecunious Romanian prince. The silver candelabra, now fitted with electric light, came from the Rhine, and each had a separate history. The royal chair, it is not
Skeleton
adequate to
ships on the
call it a
left, right?
throne, though it amounts to a throne, was looted by Napoleon from an Austrian city and bought by Felix Babylon at the sale of a French collector. At each corner of the room stands a gigantic grotesque vase of German faience of the 16th century. These were presented to Felix Babylon by William I of Germany upon the conclusion of his first incognito visit to London in connection with the French trouble of 1875. There is only one picture in the audience chamber. It is a portrait of the luckless but noble Dom Pedro, Emperor of the Brazils. Given to Felix Babylon by Dom Pedro himself, it hangs there solitary and sublime as a reminder to kings and princes that empires may pass away and greatness fall. A certain prince who was occupying the suite during the Jubilee of 1887, when the Grand Babylon had 7 persons of royal blood under its roof, sent a curt message to Felix that the portrait must be removed. Felix respectfully declined to remove it, and the prince left for another hotel, where he was robbed of £2,000 worth of jewellery. The royal audience chamber of the Grand Babylon, if people only knew it, is one of the sights of London, but it is never shown, and if you ask the hotel servants about its wonders, they will tell you only foolish facts concerning it, as that the Turkey carpet costs £50 to clean, and that one of the great vases is cracked across the pedestal, owing to the rough treatment accorded to it during a riotous game of blindman's buff, played one night by 4 young princesses, a Balkan king, and his aide-de-camp. In one of the window recesses of this magnificent apartment, on a certain afternoon in late July, stood Prince Aribert of Posen. He was faultlessly dressed in the conventional frock coat of English civilization, with a gardenia in his buttonhole, and the indispensable crease down the front of the trousers. He seemed to be fairly amused, and also to expect someone, for at frequent intervals he looked rapidly over his shoulder in the direction of the door behind the royal chair. At last, a little, wizened, stooping old man with a distinctly German cast of countenance appeared through the door and laid some papers on a small table by the side of the chair. "Ah, Hans, my old friend," said Aribert, approaching the old man. "I must have a little talk with you about 1 or 2 matters. How do you find His Royal Highness?" The old man saluted, military.
keep hitting the wrong button. I'm going in a cycle. Wait, what do I do to respawn?
When the ferry doors open, just run through them.
Gotcha.
No.
Are we running or are we fighting? What are we doing?
We're fighting. It's a little dicey for a second there, but we're back on our feet. We're going to put it on our left.
What did I do wrong? Oh, I didn't have it loaded.
You don't have to exit the cannon direction to reload it. You can do it while you're aiming.
Shoot. I missed the shot. I didn't take the shot.
Fashion.
Listen to these guys.
Not
while
very
I do
well,
this.
Your Highness, he answered. I've been valet to Your Highness's nephew since his majority, and I was valet to his royal father before him, but I never saw...
Loaded.
He stopped, and
Oh, it
threw
didn't
up
let me
his wrinkled
fire.
hands deprecatingly. You never saw what? Aribert smiled affectionately on the old fellow. You could perceive that these two, so sharply differentiated in rank, had been intimate in the past, and would be intimate again. Do you know, my prince, said the old man, that we are to receive the financier, Samson Levi, is that his name, in the audience chamber? Surely, if I may humbly suggest, the library would have been good enough for a financier. One would have thought so, agreed Prince Aribert, but perhaps your master has a special reason. Tell me, he went on, changing the subject quickly. How came it that you left the prince, my nephew, at Ostend and returned to Posen? His orders, prince. And old Hans, who had had a wide experience of royal whims and knew half the secrets of the courts of Europe, gave Aribert a look which might have meant anything. He sent me back on an errand, your highness. And you were to rejoin him here? Just so, highness, and I did rejoin him here, although, to tell the truth, I had begun to fear that I might never see my master again. The prince has been very ill in Ostend, Hans. So I have gathered, Hans responded dryly, slowly rubbing his hands together, and his highness is not yet perfectly recovered. Not yet. We despaired of his life, Hans, at one time, but thanks to an excellent constitution, he came safely through
My
the ordeal.
cats are rolling dice in
We
the
must take care
background
of him,
just in
Your Highness.
case.
Yes, indeed, said Aribert solemnly. His life is very precious to Posen. At that moment, Eugen, hereditary prince of Posen, entered the audience chamber. He was pale and languid, and his uniform seemed to be a trouble to him. His hair had been slightly ruffled, and there was a look of uneasiness, almost of alarmed unrest, in his fine dark eyes. He was like a man who is afraid to look behind him, lest he should see something there which ought not to be there.
It had the sail
But
right
at the
into
same time,
storm.
here beyond doubt was royalty. Nothing could have been more striking than the contrast between Eugen, a sick man in the shabby house at Ostend, and this Prince Eugen in the royal apartments of the Grand Babylon Hotel, surrounded by the luxury and pomp which modern civilization can offer to those born in high places. All the desperate episode of Ostend was now hidden, passed over. It was supposed never to have occurred. It existed only like a secret shame in the hearts of those who witnessed it. Prince Eugen had recovered. At any rate, he was convalescent, and he had been removed to London, where he took up again the dropped thread of his princely life. The lady with the red hat, the incorruptible and savage Miss Spencer, the unscrupulous and brilliant Jules, the dark, damp cellar, the horrible little bedroom, these things were over. Thanks to Prince Aribert and the Rexalls, he had emerged from them in safety. He was able to resume his public and official career. The Emperor had been informed of his safe arrival in London after an unavoidable delay in Ostend. His name once more figured in the court chronicle of the newspapers. In short, everything was smothered over. Only Jules, Rocco, and Miss Spencer were still at large, and the body of Reginald Dimmock lay buried in the domestic mausoleum of the palace at Posen, and Prince Eugen had still to interview Mr. Sampson Levi. That various matters lay heavy on the mind of Prince Eugen was beyond question. He seemed to
I feel like they're as bad a shot as I am.
Despite the extraordinary experiences through which he had recently passed, events which called aloud for explanations and confidence between the nephew and the uncle, he would say scarcely a word to Prince Aribert. Any allusion, however direct, to the days at Ostend was ignored by him with more or less ingenuity, and Prince Aribert was really no nearer a full solution of the mystery of Jules' plot than he had been on the night when he and Rexall visited the gaming tables at Ostend. Eugen was well aware that he had been kidnapped through the agency of the woman in the red hat, but, doubtless ashamed at having been her dupe, he would not proceed in any way with the clearing up of the matter. "You will receive in this room, Eugen?" Aribert questioned him. "Yes," was the answer, given pettishly. "Why not? Even if I have no proper retinue here, surely that is no reason why I should not hold audience in a proper manner. Hans, you can go." The old valet promptly disappeared. "Aribert," the hereditary prince continued, when they were alone in the chamber, "you think I'm mad." "My dear Eugen," said Prince Aribert, startled in spite of himself, "don't be absurd." "I say you think I'm mad. You think that attack of brain fever has left its permanent mark on me. Well, perhaps I am mad. Who can tell? God knows that I've been through enough lately to drive me mad." Aribert made no reply. As a matter of strict fact, the thought had crossed his mind that Eugen's brain had not yet recovered its normal tone and activity. This speech of his nephew's, however, had the effect of immediately restoring his belief in the latter's entire sanity. He felt convinced that if only he could regain his nephew's confidence, the old brotherly confidence which had existed between them since the years when they played together as boys, all might yet be well. But at present there appeared to be no sign that Eugen meant to give his confidence to anyone. The young prince had come up out of the valley of the shadow
we
of
did
death,
it?
but some of the valley's shadow had clung to him,
Score.
and it seemed he was unable to dissipate it. "By the way," said Eugen suddenly, "I must reward these Rexalls, I suppose. I am indeed grateful to them. If I gave the girl a bracelet and the father 1,000 guineas, how would that meet the case?" "My dear Eugen," exclaimed Aribert aghast, 1,000 guineas? Do you know that Theodore Rexall could buy up all Posen from end to end without making himself a pauper? 1,000 guineas? You might as well offer him sixpence." "Then what must I offer?" "Nothing, except your thanks. Anything else would be an insult. These are no ordinary hotel people." "Can't I give the little girl a bracelet?" Prince Eugen.
Might be hard to spot because of the storm, but it'll be here. So, there it is. You see it just off the right? God damn this storm.
gave a sinister laugh. Aribert looked at him steadily. "No," he said. "Why did you kiss her that night?" asked Prince Eugen carelessly. "Kiss whom?" said Aribert, blushing and angry, despite his most determined efforts to keep calm and unconcerned. "The Wrexhall girl." "When do you mean?" "I mean," said Prince Eugen, "that night in Ostend when I was ill. You thought I was in a delirium. Perhaps I was. But somehow I remember that with extraordinary distinctness. I remember raising my head for a fraction of an instant, and just in that fraction of an instant you kissed her. Oh, Uncle Aribert.
Grab it off the harpoon.
Listen, Eugen, for God's sake. I love Nella Wrexhall. I shall marry her." "Hugh?" There was a long pause, and then Eugen laughed. "Ah," he said, "they all talk like that to start with. I have talked like that myself, dear uncle. It sounds nice, and it means nothing." "In this case, it means everything, Eugen," said Aribert quietly. Some accent of determination in the latter's tone made Eugen rather more serious. "You can't marry her," he said. "The
That was a
Emperor
bad
won't
shot,
permit
but
a
oh well.
morganatic marriage.
Whoops.
The Emperor has nothing to do with the affair. I
Notice.
shall renounce my rights. I shall become a plain citizen. In which case you will have no fortune to speak of." "But my wife will have a fortune. Knowing the sacrifices which I shall have made in order to marry her, she will not hesitate to place that fortune in my hands for our mutual use," said Aribert stiffly. "You will decidedly be rich," mused Eugen, as his ideas dwelt on Theodore Wrexhall's reputed wealth. "But have you thought of this?" he asked, and his mild eyes glowed again in a sort of madness. "Have you thought that I am unmarried and might die at any moment, and then the throne will descend to you? To you, Aribert." "The throne will never descend to me, Eugen," said Aribert softly, "for you will live. You are thoroughly convalescent. You have nothing to fear." "It is the next 7 days that I fear," said Eugen. "The next 7 days? Why?" "I do not know, but I fear them. If I can survive them—" "Mr. Samson Levi, sire," Hans announced in a loud tone.
Golden Sands is going to be closest. That's on the west.
Chapter 20. Mr. Samson Levi
This definitely
bids
goes
Prince
to an
Eugen
outpost
good
now.
morning.
I'm glad we
Prince
didn't get
Eugen started.
our
"I will
butts
see,"
blown off.
he said, with a gesture to Hans, as if to indicate that Mr. Samson
Yeah,
Levi
normally
might
those are
enter
easy
at once.
fights, but,
"I
sailing
beg
through
one
the storm
moment
is
first,"
not
said
a simple
Aribert,
thing.
laying a hand gently on his nephew's arm, and giving old Hans a glance which had the effect of precipitating that admirably trained servant through the doorway. "What is it?" asked Prince Eugen crossly. "Why this sudden seriousness? Don't forget that I have an appointment with Mr. Samson Levi, and must not keep him waiting. Someone said that punctuality is the politeness of princes." "Eugen," said Aribert, "I wish you to be as serious as I am. Why cannot we have faith in each other? I want to help you. I have helped you. You are my titular sovereign, but on the other hand I have the honor to be your uncle. I have the honor to be the same age as you, and to have been your companion from youth up. Give me your confidence. I thought you'd given it me years ago, but have lately discovered that you had your secrets even then. And now, since your illness, you are still more secretive." "What do you mean, Aribert?" said Eugen, in a tone which might have been either inimical or friendly. "What do you want to say?" "Well, in the first place, I want to say that you will not succeed with the estimable Mr. Samson Levi." "Shall I not?" said Eugen lightly. "How do you know what my business is with him?" "Suffice it to say that I know. You will never get that £1,000,000
Am I
out of
just
him."
gonna keep bailing
Prince
because
Eugen
we're in the
gasped,
middle of a
and then
storm,
swallowed his
or
excitement.
Oh, don't
Who
bother
has been
trying to keep
talking?
up with the rain.
What
It doesn't
million?
fill the ship that quickly.
His eyes wandered uneasily round the room. "Ah," he said, pretending to laugh. "I see how it is. I've been chattering in my delirium. You mustn't take any notice of that, Aribert. When one has a fever, one's ideas become grotesque and fanciful." "You never talked in your delirium," Aribert replied. "At least not about yourself. I knew about this projected loan before I saw you in Ostend." "Who told you?" demanded Eugen fiercely.
do you want me to pull up
"Then
sails?
you admit that you're trying to raise a loan?"
Uh,
"I admit
think
nothing.
the dock
Who
will
told you?"
up to his-
"Theodore Wrexhall,
on
the
other
millionaire.
side of the
These
island.
rich men have no secrets from each other. They form
So
a
fun
coterie,
fact, lightning
closer than
can
any
hurt,
coterie of
so that's
ours,
something
Eugen.
hit that
And
powder keg.
They didn't hit the powder keg.
They didn't hit the powder keg. I'm saying that since we're in the storm, the lightning could strike it. It's not common, but it's definitely happened to me.
Oh, isn't that where we wanted to be?
It's this one ahead of us.
Oh, I'll bring the sails down a little more then.
far more powerful. They talk, and in talking they rule the world, these millionaires. They are the real monarchs.
Go ahead and drop in.
Curse them, said Eugen. Yes, perhaps so. But let me return to
Never
your
mind, I got
case. Imagine my shame, my disgust, when I found that Raxel could tell me more about your affairs than I knew myself.
Let's parch out
Happily,
a little
he is
bit.
a good
It's a
fellow.
storm,
One
so
can
I'll
trust him.
take it.
Otherwise, I should have been tempted to do something desperate when I discovered that all your private history was in his hand.
So the little stuff, like skulls, gems, we can put inside this treasure chest, so we can carry 3 at a time. And the gems, any faction will take. I usually recommend selling them to the merchants because those guys are the most annoying to level up. So let's see what we got. That goes to the Order of Souls. So does this. So go ahead and drop your skull in the treasure chest. This one as well. And then you can close that treasure chest and then carry the whole thing to the Order of Souls. When you get there, just open it up again and sell them the 3 skulls. Oh, wait. Put that down. Hit X. Ow. Put your sword away, you maniac. We're in a lightning storm. Okay, where'd you go? Oh, there you are.
I think I want to sell the powder cake first.
That's probably a good idea. The merchant is right here on the dock, so go ahead and sell to them.
Eugen, let us come to the point. Why do you want that million? Is it actually true that you are so deeply in debt? I have no desire to improve the occasion. I merely ask. And what if I do owe $1 million? Said Prince Eugen with assumed valor. Oh, nothing, my dear Eugen.
You saw nothing.
Only it is rather a large sum to have scattered in 10 years, is it not? How did you manage it? Don't ask, Aribert.
Well,
I've
I
been a
definitely
fool,
didn't blow up the
but I swear
merchant,
to you
that's
that
for
the woman
sure.
whom you call the lady in the red hat
That's 'cause
is
that's
the
not
last of my
merchant.
follies. I am about to take a wife and become a respectable prince. Then the engagement with Princess Anna is an accomplished fact. Practically so. As soon as I've settled with Levi, all will be smooth. Aribert, I wouldn't lose Anna for the imperial throne. She's a good and pure woman, and I love her as a man might love an angel. And yet you would deceive her as to your debts, Eugen. Not her, but her absurd parents, and perhaps the Emperor. They have heard rumors, and I must set those rumors at rest by presenting to them a clean sheet. I'm glad you've been frank with me, Eugen, said Prince Aribert, but I will be
That also
plain
goes
with
to
you.
the merchants.
You will never marry the Princess
What I
Anna.
just grabbed also goes to the merchant.
And why? Said Eugen, supercilious again. Because her parents will not permit it. Because you will not be able to present a clean sheet to them. Because this Samson Levi will never lend you $1 million. Explain yourself. I propose to do so. You were kidnapped. It is a horrid word, but we must use it. In Ostend. True. Do you know why? I suppose because that vile old red-headed woman and her accomplices wanted to get some money out of me. Fortunately, thanks to you, they didn't. Not at all, said Aribert. They wanted no money from you. They knew well enough that you had no money. They knew you were the naughty schoolboy among European princes, with no sense of responsibility or of duty towards your kingdom.
That goes to the
Shall I tell you why they kidnapped you?
This.
When you've done abusing me, my dear uncle. They kidnapped you merely to keep you out of England for a few days, merely to compel you to fail in your appointment with Samson Levi, and it appears to me that they succeeded. Assuming that you don't obtain the money from Levi, is there another financier in all Europe from whom you can get it, on such strange security as you have to offer? Possibly there's not, said Prince Eugen calmly. But, you see, I shall get it from Samson Levi. Levi promised it, and I know from other sources that he is a man of his word. He said that the money, subject to certain formalities, would be available till the end of June.
And this chest.
And it is now the end of July.
Where'd you go?
Well, what is a month? He's only too glad to lend the money. He will get excellent interest. How on earth have you got into your sage old head this notion of a plot against me? The idea is ridiculous. A plot against me? What for? Have you ever thought of Bosnia? Asked Aribert coldly. What of Bosnia? I need not tell you that the King of Bosnia is naturally under obligations to Austria, to whom he owes his crown. Austria is anxious for him to make a good, influential marriage. Well, let him. He is going to. He is going to marry the Princess Anna. Not while I live. He made overtures there a year ago and was rebuffed. Yes, but he will make overtures again, and this time he will not be rebuffed. Oh,
So
Eugen, can't you see that this plot against you
is
is being engineered by some persons who know all about your affairs, and whose desire is to prevent your marriage with Princess Anna? Only one man in Europe can have any motive for
Let's
wishing to
one by
prevent
one.
your marriage with Princess Anna, and that is the man who means to marry her himself.
You can sell the chest itself. to
Eugen
the
went
gold
very
ones if you
pale.
want, but only once it's empty.
Then, Aribert, do you mean to convey to me that my detention in Ostend was contrived by the agents of the King of Bosnia? I do. With a view to stopping my negotiations with Samson Levi, and so putting an end to the possibility of my marriage with Anna. Aribert nodded. You're a good friend to me, Aribert. You mean well, but you are mistaken. You have been worrying about nothing. Have you forgotten about Reginald Dimmock? I remember you said that he died. I said nothing of the sort. I said that he had been assassinated. That was part of it, my poor Eugen. Pooh, said Eugen. I don't believe he was assassinated. And as for Samson Levi, I will bet you
Wow, he
1,000
bought it for
marks
600.
that he and I come to terms this morning, and that the million is in my hands before I leave London. Aribert shook his head. You seem to be pretty sure of Mr. Levi's character. Have you had much to do with him before? Well,
So we also
Eugen
got,
hesitated a second.
supply crate
A little.
here, the
What young
storage
man in
crate,
my position hasn't had
which
something to
is-
do with Mr. Samson
just used to
Levi
hold
at one time
resources.
or another?
so you can
I
fill it
haven't,
with stuff and
said
then access
Aribert.
it, if you need
You?
it to
You are.
keep more cannons, or if you want to keep planks on deck or whatever. Also good for carrying onto islands and looting all the barrels in one trip.
Yeah, I saw the other guy do that. Maybe we'll hold on to it because I think I picked up one island mission. Oh, and the mission that I put down disappeared.
Yeah, we completed it when we killed the captain. Like I said, there's no actual reward for finishing missions. They just are a way to get loot. Ooh. So this one has 2 islands. So if you're looking at your quest wheel, there are 4 skulls in there right now. 2 of those are from the mission. Those are the ones with like the
fossil. He rang a silver bell. Hans, I will receive Mrs. Sampson Levi. Whereupon Aribert discreetly departed, and Prince Eugen sat down in the great velvet chair and began to look at the papers which Hans had previously placed upon the table. Good morning, your Royal Highness, said Sampson Levi, bowing as he entered. I trust your Royal Highness is well. Moderately, thanks, returned the prince. In spite of the fact that he had had as much to do with people of royal blood as any plain man in Europe, Sampson Levi had never yet learned how to be at ease with these exalted individuals during the first few minutes of an interview. Afterwards, he resumed command of himself and his faculties, but at the beginning he was invariably flustered, scarlet of face, and inclined to perspiration. We will proceed to business at once, said Prince Eugen. Will you take a seat, Mr. Levi? I thank your Royal Highness. Now, as to that loan, which we had already practically arranged. $1 million,
So
I
not
think
for
it was,
us.
said the prince airily. $1 million, Levi acquiesced, toying with his enormous watch chain. Everything is now in order. Here are the papers, and I should like to finish the matter up at once. Exactly, your Highness, but what? You months ago expressed the warmest satisfaction at the security, though I am quite prepared to admit that the security is of rather an unusual nature.
Sounds good.
You also agreed to the rate of interest. It is not everyone, Mr. Levi, who can lend out $1 million at 5.5%, and in 10 years the whole amount will be paid back. I believe I informed you that the fortune of Princess Anna, who is about to accept my hand, will ultimately amount to something like 50 millions of marks, which is over £2 million in your English money. Prince Eugen stopped. He had no fancy for talking in this confidential manner to financiers, but he felt that circumstances demanded it. You see, it's like this, your Royal Highness, began Mr. Sampson Levi in his homely English idiom. It's like this. I said I could keep that bit of money available till the end of June, and you were to give me an interview here before that date. Not having heard from your Highness, and not knowing your Highness's address, though my German agents made every inquiry, I concluded that you'd made other arrangements, money being so cheap these last few months.
Just to put the sales down.
I was unfortunately detained at Ostend, said Prince Eugen, with as much haughtiness as he could assume, by important business. I've made no other arrangements, and I shall have need of the $1 million, if you will be so good as to pay it to my London bankers. I'm very sorry, said Mr. Sampson Levi, with a tremendous and dazzling air of politeness, which surprised even himself. But my syndicate has now lent the money elsewhere. It is in South America. I don't mind telling your Highness that we've lent it to the Chilean government. Hang the Chilean government, Mr. Levi, exclaimed the prince, and he went white. I must have that $1 million. It was an arrangement. It was an arrangement, I admit, said Mr. Sampson Levi. But your Highness broke the arrangement. There was a long silence. Do you mean to say, began the prince with tense calmness, that you are not in a position to let me have that $1 million? I could let your Highness have $1 million in a couple of years' time. The prince made a gesture of annoyance. Mr. Levi, he said, if you do not place the money in my hands tomorrow, you will ruin one of the oldest of reigning families, and incidentally, you will alter the map of Europe. You are not keeping faith, and I had relied on you. Pardon me, your Highness, said little Levi, rising in resentment. It is not I who have not kept faith. I beg to repeat that the money is no longer at my disposal, and to bid your Highness good morning. And Mr. Sampson Levi left the audience chamber with an awkward, aggrieved bow. It was a scene characteristic of the end of the 19th century, an overfed, commonplace, pursy little man
Is
who had
the
been
shark
born in a
worth
Brixton
killing?
semi-detached villa, and whose highest idea of pleasure was a Sunday up the river
There's
in an
treasure.
expensive
There's
electric launch,
treasure.
confronting and utterly routing in a hotel belonging to an American millionaire, the representative of a race of men who had fingered every page of European history for centuries, and who still, in their native castles, were surrounded with every outward circumstance of pomp and power.
So this one gem is
Aribert,
worth
said
like
Prince Eugen
5,000
a little later, you were right. It is all over. I have only one refuge. You don't mean... Aribert stopped, dumbfounded. Yes, I do, he said quickly. I can manage it so that it will look like an accident. End of chapter 19 and 20.
Is there anything else over there that's worth anything?
There's a gold trinket and another staff weapon. Which I wish the shark were still here. I actually forgot, but the staff weapons are great at killing those sharks. So normally they circle the ship and you have to hit them with cannons a bunch, and it's kind of a pain in the ass. But with the staff weapons, you can just kind of like pepper them from the deck of the ship.
I got the gold trinket.
Chapter 21 and 22 of the Grand Babylon Hotel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. The Grand Babylon Hotel by Arnold Bennett. Chapter 21. The Return of Felix Babylon. On the evening of Prince Eugen's fateful interview with Mr. Sampson Levi, Theodore Raxall was wandering somewhat aimlessly and uneasily about the entrance hall and adjacent corridors of the Grand Babylon. He had returned from Ostend only a day or two previously, and had endeavoured, with all his might, to forget the affair which had carried him there, to regard it, in fact, as done with. But he found himself unable to do so. In vain he remarked under his breath that there were some things which were best left alone. If his experience as a manipulator of markets, a contriver of gigantic schemes in New York, had taught him anything at all, it should surely have taught him that. Yet he could not feel reconciled to such a position. The mere presence of the princess in his hotel roused the fighting instincts of this man who had never in his whole career been beaten. He had, as it were, taken up arms on their side, and if the Princess of Posen would not continue their own battle, nevertheless he, Theodore Raxall, wanted to continue it for them. To a certain extent, of course, the battle had been won, for Prince Eugen had been rescued from an extremely difficult and dangerous position, and the enemy, consisting of Jules, Rocco, Miss Spencer, and perhaps others, had been put to flight.
Do we want to get anything else?
But that, he conceived, was not enough. It was very far from being enough. That the criminals, for criminals they decidedly were, should still be at large, he regarded as an absurd anomaly. And there was another point. He had said nothing to the police of all that had occurred. He disdained the police, but he could scarcely fail to perceive that if the police should by accident gain a clue to the real state of the case, he might be placed rather awkwardly, for the simple reason that in the eyes of the law it amounted to a misdemeanor to conceal as much as he had concealed. He asked himself, for the thousandth time, why he had adopted a policy of concealment from the police, why he had become in any way interested in the Posen matter, and why, at this present moment, he should be so anxious to prosecute it further. To the first two questions he replied, rather lamely, that he had been influenced by Nella, and also by a natural spirit of adventure. To the third he replied that he had always been in the habit of carrying things through, and was now actuated by a mere childish, obstinate desire to carry this one through. Moreover, he was splendidly conscious of his perfect ability to carry it through. One additional impulse he had, though he did not admit it to himself, being by nature adverse to big words, and that was an abstract love of justice, the Anglo-Saxon's deep-found instinct for helping the right side to conquer, even when grave risks must thereby be run, with no corresponding advantage. He was turning these things over in his mind as he walked about the vast hotel on that evening of the last day in July. The society papers had been stating for a week past that London was empty, but, in spite of the society papers, London persisted in seeming to be just as full as ever. The Grand Babylon was certainly not as crowded as it had been a month earlier, but it was doing a very passable business. At the close of the season, the gay butterflies of the social community have a habit of hovering for a day or two in the big hotels, before they flutter away to castle and country house, meadow and moor, lake and stream. The great basket chairs in the portico were well filled by old and middle-aged gentlemen engaged in enjoying the varied delights of liqueurs, cigars, and the full moon, which floated so serenely above.
Gotta fight this guy.
Did you already find him?
Now different threats popped up on the beach.
The Thames. Here and there a pretty woman, on the arm of a cavalier in immaculate attire, swept her train as she turned to and fro in the promenade of the terrace. Waiters and uniformed commissionaires and gold-braided doorkeepers moved noiselessly about. At short intervals, the chief of the doorkeepers blew his shrill whistle, and hansoms drove up with tinkling bell to take away a pair of butterflies to some place of amusement or boredom. Occasionally, a private carriage, drawn by expensive and self-conscious horses, put the hansoms to shame by its mere outward glory. It was a hot night, a night for the summer woods, and save for the vehicles, there was no rapid movement of any kind. It seemed as though the world, that is to say, of the Grand Babylon, was fully engaged in the solemn processes of digestion and small talk. Even the long row of the embankment gas lamps, stretching right and left, scarcely trembled in the still, warm, caressing air. The stars overhead looked down with many blinkings upon the enormous pile of the Grand Babylon, and the moon regarded it with bland and changeless face. What they thought of it and its inhabitants cannot, unfortunately, be recorded. What Theodore Rexel thought of the moon can be recorded. He thought it was a nuisance. It somehow fascinated his gaze with its silly stare, and so interfered with his complex meditations. He glanced round at the well-dressed and satisfied people, his guests, his customers. They appeared to ignore him absolutely. Probably only a very small percentage of them had the least idea that this tall, spare man, with the iron-grey hair and the thin, firm, resolute face, who wore his American-cut evening clothes with such careless ease, was the sole proprietor of the Grand Babylon, and possibly the richest man in Europe. As has already been stated, Rexel was not a celebrity in England. The guests of the Grand Babylon saw merely a restless male person whose restlessness was rather a disturber of their quietude, but with whom, to judge by his countenance, it would be inadvisable to remonstrate. Therefore Theodore Rexel continued his perambulations unchallenged, and kept saying to himself, "I must do something." But what? He could think of no course to pursue. At last he walked straight through the hotel and out at the other entrance, and so up the little unassuming side street into the roaring torrent of the narrow and crowded Strand. He jumped on a Putney bus and paid his fare to Putney, 5d, and then, finding that the humble occupants of the vehicle stared at the spectacle of a man in evening dress but without a dust-coat, he jumped off again, oblivious of the fact that the conductor jerked a thumb towards him and winked at the passengers as who should say, "There goes a lunatic." He went into a tobacconist's shop and asked for a cigar. The shopman mildly inquired what price. "What are the best you've got?" asked Theodore Rexel. 5 shillings each, sir," said the man promptly. "Give me a penny one," was Theodore Rexel's laconic request, and he walked out of the shop smoking the penny cigar. It was a new sensation for him. He was inhaling the aromatic odours of Eugene Rimmel's establishment for the sale of scents, when a gentleman, walking slowly in the opposite direction, accosted him with a quiet, "Good evening, Mr. Rexel." The millionaire did not at first recognize his interlocutor, who wore a travelling overcoat and was carrying a handbag. Then a slight, pleased smile passed over his features, and he held out his hand. "Well, Mr. Babylon," he greeted the other, "of all persons in the wide world, you are the man I would most have wished to meet." "You flatter me," said the little anglicized Swiss. "No, I don't," answered Rexel. "It isn't my custom, any more than it's yours. I wanted to have a real good long yarn with you, and lo, here you are. Where have you sprung from?" "From Lausanne," said Felix Babylon. "I had finished my duties there, and I had nothing else to do, and I felt homesick. I felt the nostalgia of London, and so I came over, just as you see," and he raised the handbag for Rexel's notice. "1 toothbrush, 1 razor, 2 slippers, eh?" He laughed. "I was wondering as I walked along where I should stay. Me, Felix Babylon, homeless in London." "I should advise you to stay at the Grand Babylon," Rexel laughed back. "It is a good hotel, and I know the proprietor personally." "Rather expensive, is it not?" said Babylon. To you, sir, answered Rexel, the inclusive terms will be exactly half a crown a week. Do you accept? I accept, said Babylon, and added, You're very good, Mr. Rexel. They strolled together back to the hotel, saying nothing in particular, but feeling very content with each other's company. Many customers? Asked Felix Babylon. Very tolerable, said Rexel, assuming as much of the air of the professional hotel proprietor as he could. I think I may say, in the storekeeper's phrase, that if there is any business about, I'm doing it. Tonight the people are all on the terrace in the portico. It's so confoundedly hot, and the consumption of ice is simply enormous, nearly as large as it would be in New York. In that case, said Babylon politely, let me offer you another
That's the
cigar.
second time I've died by that.
But I've not finished this one. That is just why I wish to offer you another one. A cigar such as yours, my good friend, ought never to be smoked within the precincts of the Grand Babylon, not even by the proprietor of the Grand Babylon, and especially when all the guests are assembled in the portico. The fumes of it would ruin any hotel.
It is killing the skeletons.
Theodore Rexel laughingly lighted the Rothschild Havana, which Babylon gave him, and they entered the hotel arm in arm. But no sooner had they mounted the steps than little Felix became the object of numberless greetings. It appeared that he had been highly popular among his quondam guests. At last they reached the managerial room, where Babylon was regaled on a chicken, and Rexel assisted him in the consumption of a bottle of Heidsieck Monopole, Carte d'Or. This chicken is almost perfectly grilled, said Babylon at length. It is a credit to the house. But why, my dear Rexel, why in the name of heaven did you quarrel with Rocco? Then you've heard? Heard? My dear friend, it was in every newspaper on the continent. Some journals prophesied that the Grand Babylon...
Did we succeed?
We did. Your 2 suicide runs cleared all the skeleton waves.
There we go. That's why it's always good to have a teammate, so then that way they can go suicide on you.
would have to close its doors within half a year now that Rocco had deserted it. But of course I knew better. I knew that you must have a good reason for allowing Rocco to depart, and that you must have made arrangements in advance for a substitute. As a matter of fact, I had not made arrangements in advance, said Theodore Rexel, a little ruefully. But happily we found in our second sous-chef an artist inferior only to Rocco himself. That, however, was mere good fortune. Surely, said Babylon, it was indiscreet to trust to mere good fortune in such a serious matter. I didn't trust to mere good fortune. I didn't trust to anything except Rocco, and he deceived me. But why did you quarrel with him? I didn't quarrel with him. I found him embalming a corpse in the state bedroom one night. You what? Babylon almost screamed. I found him embalming a corpse in the state bedroom, repeated Rexel in his quietest tones. The two men gazed at each other, and then Rexel replenished Babylon's glass. Tell me, said Babylon, settling himself deep in an easy-chair and lighting a cigar. And Rexel thereupon recounted to him the whole of the Posen episode, with every circumstantial detail so far as he knew it. It was a long and complicated recital, and occupied about an hour. During that time, little Felix never spoke a word, scarcely moved a muscle. Only his small eyes gazed through the bluish haze of smoke. The clock on the mantelpiece tinkled midnight. Time for whiskey and soda, said Rexel, and got up as if to ring the bell, but Babylon waved him back. You have told me that this Samson Levi had an audience of Prince Eugen today, but you have not told me the result of that audience, said Babylon. Because I do not yet know it, but I shall doubtless know tomorrow. In the meantime, I feel fairly sure that Levi declined to produce Prince Eugen's required million. I have reason to believe that the money was lent elsewhere. Mused Babylon, and then, carelessly, I'm not at all surprised at that arrangement for spying through the bathroom of the state apartments. Why are you...
Right-click aims, left-click to charge shots.
I'll play with it later.
You're not surprised? Oh, said Babylon, it is such an obvious dodge, so easy to carry out. As for me, I took special care never to involve myself in these affairs. I knew they existed. I somehow felt that they existed. But I also felt that they lay outside my sphere.
Are they worth
My
killing?
business was to provide board and lodging of the most sumptuous kind to those who didn't mind paying for it.
That
And I
sounds
did my
like it would be
business.
fun.
If anything else went on in the hotel, under the rose, I long determined to ignore it unless it should happen to be brought before my notice. And it never was brought before my notice. However, I admit that there is a certain pleasurable excitement in this kind of affair, and doubtless you have experienced that. I have, said Rexall simply, though I believe you are laughing at me. By no means, Babylon replied. Now what, if I may ask the question, is going to be your next step? That is just what I desire to know myself, said Theodore Rexall. Well, said Babylon after a pause, let us begin. In the first place, it is possible you may be interested to hear that I happened to see Jules today. You did? Rexall remarked with much calmness. Where? Well, it was early this morning, in Paris, just before I left there. The meeting was quite accidental, and Jules seemed rather surprised at meeting me. He respectfully inquired where I was going, and I said that I was going to Switzerland. At that moment I thought I was going to Switzerland. It had occurred to me that after all I should be happier there, and that I had better turn back and not see London any more. However, I changed my mind once again, and decided to come on to London, and accept the risks of being miserable there without my hotel. Then I asked Jules whither he was bound, and he told me that he was off to Constantinople, being interested in a new French hotel there. I wished him good luck, and we parted. Constantinople, eh? Said Rexall. A highly suitable place for him, I should say. But, Babylon resumed, I caught sight of him again. Where? At Charing Cross, a few minutes before I had the pleasure of meeting you. Mr. Jules had not gone to Constantinople after all. He did not see me, or I should have suggested to him that in going from Paris to Constantinople it is not usual to travel via London. The cheek of the fellow! Exclaimed Theodore Rexall. The gorgeous and colossal cheek of the fellow! Chapter 22. In the Wine Cellars of the Grand Babylon. Do you know anything of the antecedents of this Jules? Asked Theodore Rexall, helping himself to whiskey. Nothing whatever, said Babylon. Until you told me, I don't think I was
You
aware
and
that
Babylon
his
became
true name
friends
was
again.
Thomas Jackson, though of course I knew that it was not Jules. I certainly was not aware that Miss Spencer was his wife, but I had long suspected that their relations were somewhat more intimate than the nature of their respective duties in the hotel absolutely demanded. All that I do know of Jules, who will always be called Jules, is that he gradually, by some mysterious personal force, acquired a prominent position in the hotel. Decidedly, he was the cleverest and most intellectual waiter I have ever known, and he was specially skilled in the difficult task of retaining his own dignity while not interfering with that of other people. I'm afraid this information
but
is a
he's
little
bit
too
of a
vague to be of
psychopath.
any practical assistance in the present difficulty. What is the present difficulty? Rexall queried, with a simple air. I should imagine that the present difficulty is to account for the man's presence in London. That is easily accounted for, said Rexall. How? Do you suppose he is anxious to give himself up to justice, or that the chains of habit bind him to the hotel? Neither, said Rexall. Jules is going to have another try, that's all. Another try at what? At Prince Eugen, either at his life or his liberty. Most probably the former this time, almost certainly the former. He has guessed that we are somewhat handicapped by our anxiety to keep Prince Eugen's predicament quite quiet, and he is taking advantage of that fact.
Wait,
As he already
did you
is
say
fairly
there's
rich
another
on his
skeleton
own
sleuth?
admission, the reward which has been offered to him must be enormous, and he is absolutely determined to get it. He has several times recently proved himself to be a daring fellow. Unless I am mistaken, he will shortly prove himself to be still more daring. But what can he do? Surely you don't suggest that he will attempt the life of Prince Eugen in this hotel? Why not? If
Should I
Reginald
grab any of the
fell
different
on mere
types of
suspicion
cannonballs?
that he would turn out unfaithful to the conspiracy, why not Prince Eugen? But it would be an unspeakable crime, and do infinite harm to...
Do they do basic damage to the boat?
I don't remember. I don't think they do, actually.
Oh, then never mind. Should we also pepper their boat with the staffs that we have?
Those definitely don't hurt the boat, unfortunately.
Oh.
The damage, if you charge it up more, it does a little bit of splash damage, which will hurt the skeletons on board. But the projectile moves so slow that it's really hard to hit another ship with it.
The hotel. True, Raxel admitted, smiling.
Back here.
Little Felix Babylon seemed to brace himself for the grasping of his monstrous idea. How could it possibly be done? He asked at length. Dimmock was poisoned. Yes, but you had Rocco here then, and Rocco was in the plot. It is conceivable that Rocco could have managed it. Barely conceivable. But without Rocco, I cannot think it possible. I cannot even think that Jules would attempt it. You see, in a place like the Grand Babylon, as probably I needn't point out to you, food has to pass through so many hands that to poison one person without killing perhaps 50 would be a most delicate operation. Moreover, Prince Eugen, unless he has changed his habits, is always served by his own attendant, old Hans, and therefore any attempt to tamper with a cooked dish immediately before serving would be hazardous in the extreme. Granted, said Raxel. The wine, however, might be more easily got at. Had you thought of that? I had not, Babylon admitted. You are an ingenious theorist, but I happen to know that Prince Eugen always has his wine opened in his own presence. No doubt it would be opened by Hans. Therefore, the wine theory is not tenable, my friend. I do not see why, said Raxel, and I very seldom drink it, but it seems to me that a bottle of wine might be tampered with while it was still in the cellar, especially if there was an accomplice in the hotel. You think, then, that you are not yet rid of all your conspirators? I think that Jules might still have an accomplice within the building, and that a bottle of wine could be opened and recorked without leaving any trace of the operation? Babylon was a trifle sarcastic. I don't see the necessity of opening the bottle in order to poison the wine, said Raxel. I've never tried to poison anybody by means of a bottle of wine, and I don't lay claim to any natural talent as a poisoner, but I think I could devise several ways of managing the trick. Of course, I admit I may be entirely mistaken as to Jules' intentions. Ah, said Felix Babylon. The wine cellars beneath us are one of the wonders of London. I hope you are aware, Mr. Raxel, that when you bought the Grand Babylon, you bought what is probably the finest stock of wines in England, if not in Europe. In the valuation, I reckoned them at £60,000, and I may say that I always took care that the cellars were properly guarded. Even Jules would experience a serious difficulty in breaking into the cellars without the connivance of the wine clerk, and the wine clerk is, or was, incorruptible. I'm ashamed to say that I have not yet inspected my wines, smiled Raxel. I have never given them a thought. Once or twice I have taken the trouble to make a tour of the hotel, but I omitted the cellars in my excursions. Impossible, my dear fellow, said Babylon, amused at such a confession. To him, a great connoisseur and lover of fine wines, almost incredible. But really, you must see them tomorrow. If I may, I will accompany you. Why not tonight? Raxel suggested, calmly. Tonight? It is very late. Hubbard will have gone to bed. And may I ask who is Hubbard? I remember the name but dimly. Hubbard is the wine clerk of the Grand Babylon, said Felix, with a certain emphasis. A sedate man of 40.
Come on.
He has the keys of the cellars. He knows every bottle of every bin, its date, its qualities, its value. And he is a teetotaler. Hubbard is a curiosity. No wine can leave the cellars without his knowledge, and no person can enter the cellars without his knowledge. At least, that is how it was in my time, Babylon added. We will wake him, said Raxel. But it is 1 o'clock in the morning, Babylon protested. Never mind. That is, if you consent to accompany me.
Oh no, I died on their ship.
By night as by day. Therefore, why not now? Babylon shrugged his shoulders. As you wish, he agreed, with his indestructible politeness. And now to find this Mr. Hubbard, with his key of the cupboard, said
I thought I
Raxel,
shot you
as they
point
walked
blank
out of
with
the
a
room
cannonball.
together. Although
glad
the
I
hour
didn't.
was so late, the hotel was not, of course, closed for the night. A few guests still remained about in the public rooms, and a few fatigued waiters were still in attendance. One of these latter was dispatched in search of the singular Mr. Hubbard, and it fortunately turned out that this gentleman had not actually retired, though he was on the point of doing so. He brought the keys to Mr. Raxel in person, and after he had had a little chat with his former master, the proprietor and the ex-proprietor of the Grand Babylon Hotel proceeded on their way to the cellars. These cellars extend over, or rather under, quite half the superficial areas of the whole hotel, the longitudinal half which lies next to the Strand. Owing to the fact that the ground slopes sharply from the Strand to the river, the Grand Babylon is, so to speak, deeper near the Strand than it is near the Thames. Towards the Thames there is, below the entrance level, a basement and a sub-basement. Towards the Strand there is basement, sub-basement, and the huge wine cellars beneath all. After descending the 4 flights of the service stairs and traversing a long passage running parallel with the kitchen, the two found themselves opposite a door, which, on being unlocked, gave access to another flight of stairs. At the foot of this was the main entrance to the cellars. Outside the entrance was the wine lift, for the ascension of delicious fluids to the upper floors, and opposite Mr. Hubbard's little office. There was electric light everywhere. Babylon, who, as being most accustomed to them, held the bunch of keys, opened the great door, and then they were in the first cellar, the first of a suite of 5. Raxel was struck not only by the icy coolness of the place, but also by its vastness. Babylon had seized a portable electric hand light attached to a long wire which lay handy, and, waving it about, disclosed the dimensions of the place. By that flashing illumination the subterranean chamber looked unutterably
Very slowly
weird and
coming back
mysterious,
to you.
with its rows of numbered bins stretching away into the distance till their radiance was reduced to the occasional far gleam of the light
Did you
on the
die?
shoulder of a bottle. Then Babylon switched on the fixed electric lights, and Theodore Raxel entered upon a personally conducted tour of what was quite the most interesting part of his own property. To see the innocent
You sink their
enthusiasm of
ship.
Felix Babylon for these stores of exhilarating liquid was what is called in the north a sight for serene. He displayed to Raxel's bewildered gaze, in their due order, all the wines of 3 continents, nay, of 4, for the superb and luscious Constantia wine of Cape Colony was not wanting in that most catholic collection of vintages. Beginning with the unsurpassed products of Burgundy, he continued with the clares of Medoc, Bordeaux, and Sauternes, then to the champagnes of Aix, Haute-Villiers, and Pierry, then to the Hocks and Moselle of Germany, and the brilliant imitation champagnes of Maine, Neckar, and Naumburg, then to the famous and adorable Tokay of Hungary, and all the Austrian varieties of French wines, including Karlowitz and Sumlauer, then to the dry sherries of Spain, including purest Manzanilla, and Amontillado, and Vino de Pasto, then to the wines of Malaga, both sweet and dry, and all the Spanish reds from Catalonia, including the dark tent, so often used sacramentally, then to the renowned port of Oporto. Then he proceeded to the Italian cellar, and descanted upon the excellence of Barolo
Did you
from
grab the thing
Piedmont,
out of my hand?
of Chianti from Tuscany,
Yeah,
of Orvieto from the Roman states, of the Tears of Christ from Naples,
I
and the
didn't know
Comune of
you could do
Marsala
that. That was
from
funny.
Sicily, and so on, to an extent and with a fullness of detail which cannot be rendered here. At the end of the suite of cellars there was a glazed door, which, as could be seen, gave access to a supplemental and smaller cellar, an apartment about 15 or 16 feet square. "Anything special in there?" asked Raxel curiously, as they stood before the door and looked within at the serried ends of bottles. "Ah!" exclaimed Babylon, almost smacking his lips. "Therein lies the cream of all." "The best champagne, I suppose," said Raxel. "Yes," said Babylon, "the best champagne is there, a very special Sillery, as exquisite as you will find anywhere. But I see, my friend, that you fall into the common error of putting champagne first among wines. That distinction belongs to Burgundy. You have old Burgundy in that cellar, Mr. Raxel, which cost me, how much do you think? £80 a bottle. Probably it will never be drunk," he added with a sigh. "It is too expensive even for princes and plutocrats." "Yes, it will," said Raxel quickly. "You and I will have a bottle up tomorrow." "Then," continued Babylon, still riding his hobby horse, "there is a sample of the Rhine wine, dated 1706, which caused such a sensation at the Vienna exhibition of 1873.
No, as soon as I
There's
jump
also
on
a
people.
singularly glorious Persian wine from Shiraz,
I
the
didn't
like
stop
of which
trying.
I've never seen elsewhere. Also,
Okay,
there is an unrivaled vintage of Romanée
Now you can
Conti,
just shoot me.
greatest of all modern Burgundies. If I remember right, Prince Eugen invariably has a bottle when he comes to stay here. It is not on the hotel wine list, of course, and only a few customers know of it. We do not precisely hawk it about the dining room. Indeed, said Rexel. Let us go inside. They entered the stone apartment, rendered almost sacred by the preciousness
I
of
think
the
that was
content,
it.
and Rexel looked round with a strangely intent and curious air. At the far side was a grating, through which came a feeble light.
Oh, it's empty.
What is that? Asked the millionaire sharply.
Shoot bastards.
That is merely a ventilation grating. Good ventilation is absolutely essential. Looks broken, doesn't it? Rexel suggested, and then, putting a finger quickly on Babylon's shoulder, There's someone in the cellar. Can't you hear breathing, down there, behind that bin? The two men stood tense and silent for a while, listening, under the ray of the single electric light in the ceiling. Half the cellar was involved in gloom. At length Rexel walked firmly down the central passageway between the bins and turned to the corner at the right.
You use F to actually
Come out,
fix it at the
you
chest,
villain,
you
he
know,
said
use X
in
to-
a low, well-nigh vicious tone, and dragged up a cowering figure.
Oh.
He had expected to find a man,
Okay.
but it was his own daughter, Nella Rexel,
Alright,
upon
let's see
whom
if-
he had laid angry hands.
Oh, that's not bad.
End of chapter 21 and 22.
Your K is just to the east.
Sounds like Rexel and Babylon are getting along good again. Probably because Babylon realized
Chapter
how
23 and
psychotic
24
his
of the
old
Grand
staff
Babylon
was.
Hotel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. The Grand Babylon Hotel by Arnold Bennett. Chapter 23. Further events in the cellar. Well, father, Nella greeted her astounded parent, you should make sure that you've got hold of the right person before you use all that terrible muscular force of yours. I do believe you've broken my shoulder bone. She rubbed her shoulder with a comical expression of pain, and then stood up before the two men. The skirt of her dark grey dress was torn and dirty, and the usually trim Nella looked as though she'd been shot down a canvas fire escape. Mechanically, she smoothed her frock and gave a straightening touch to her hair. Good evening, Miss Rexel, said Felix Babylon, bowing formally. This is an unexpected pleasure. Felix's drawing-room manners never deserted him upon any occasion whatever. May I inquire what you are doing in my wine cellar, Nella Rexel? Said the millionaire, a little stiffly. He was certainly somewhat annoyed at having mistaken his daughter for a criminal. Moreover, he hated to be surprised, and upon this occasion he had been surprised beyond any ordinary surprise. Lastly, he was not at all pleased that Nella should be observed in that strange predicament by a stranger.
You're on my blanket.
I will tell you, said Nella. I'd been reading rather late in my room. The night was so close. I heard Big Ben strike 12:30, and then I put the book down and went out onto the balcony of my window for a little fresh air before going to bed. I leaned over the balcony very quietly. You will remember that I am on the 3rd floor now, and looked down below into the little sunk yard which separates the
never
wall of
loves
the
my
hotel
affection
from
like this.
Salisbury Lane. I was rather astonished to see a figure creeping across the yard. I knew there was no entrance into the hotel from that yard, and besides, it is 15 or 20 feet below the level of the street. So I watched. The figure went close up against the wall and disappeared from my view. I leant over the balcony as far as I dared, but I couldn't see him. I could hear him, however. What could you hear?
Oof, just
Questioned
missed that
Rexel
mark there.
sharply. It sounded like a sawing noise, said Nella, and it went on for quite a long time, nearly a quarter of an hour, I should think. A rasping sort of noise. Why on earth didn't you come and warn me or someone else in the hotel?
Raise the sails.
Asked Rexel. Oh, I don't know, Dad, she replied sweetly. I got interested in it, and I thought I would see it out myself. Well, as I was saying, Mr. Babylon, she
Sorry,
continued, addressing
I was
the remark
later
to
on
Felix
drawing both
with
those.
a dazzling smile.
No, I didn't
That
come.
noise went on for quite a long time. At last it stopped, and the figure reappeared from under the wall, crossed the yard, climbed up the opposite wall by some means or other, and so over the railings into Salisbury Lane. I felt rather relieved then, because I knew he hadn't actually broken into the hotel. He walked down Salisbury Lane very slowly. A policeman was just coming up.
Did you
"Good night,
close up
officer,"
any damage?
I heard him say to the policeman, and he asked him for a match. The policeman supplied the match, and the other man lighted a cigarette and proceeded further down the lane. By cricking your neck from my window, Mr. Babylon, you can get a glimpse of the embankment and the river. I saw the man cross the embankment and lean over the river wall, where he seemed to be talking to someone. He then walked along the embankment to Westminster, and that was the last I saw of him. I waited a minute or two for him to come back, but he didn't come back, and so I thought it was about time I began to make inquiries into the affair. I went downstairs instantly and out of the hotel, through the quadrangle, into Salisbury Lane, and I looked over those railings. There was a ladder on the other side, by which it was perfectly easy, once you had got over the railings, to climb down into the yard.
I just noticed the cannon was still loaded, and I figured I'd take a pot shot at one of them, and I blew him up with the cannon.
Did, and I surmounted them, with no worse damage than a torn skirt. I crossed the yard on tiptoe, and I found that, in the wall, close to the ground, and almost exactly under my window, there was an iron grating, about 1 foot by 14 inches. I suspected, as there was no other ironwork near, that the mysterious visitor must have been sawing at this grating for private purposes of his own. I gave it a good shake, and I was not at all surprised that a good part of it came off in my hand, leaving just enough room for a person to creep through. I decided that I would creep through, and now I wish I hadn't. I don't know, Mr. Babylon, whether you have ever tried to creep through a small hole with a skirt on. Have you? I have not had that pleasure, said little Felix, bowing again, and absently taking up a bottle which lay to his hand. Well, you are fortunate, the imperturbable Nella resumed. For quite 3 minutes I thought I should perish in that grating, Dad, with my shoulder inside and the rest of me outside. However, at last, by the most amazing and agonizing efforts, I pulled myself through and fell into this extraordinary cellar, more dead than alive. Then I wondered what I should do next. Should I wait for the mysterious visitor to return and stab him with my pocket scissors if he tried to enter, or should I raise an alarm? First of all, I replaced the broken grating. Then I struck a match, and I saw that I'd got landed in a wilderness of bottles. The match went out, and I hadn't another one, so I sat down in the corner to think. I just decided to wait and see if the visitor returned, when I heard footsteps, and then voices, and then you came in. I must say I was rather taken aback, especially as I recognized the voice of Mr. Babylon. You see, I didn't want to frighten you. If I'd bobbed up from behind the bottles and said boo, you would have had a serious shock. I wanted to think of a way of breaking my presence gently to you. But you saved me the trouble, Dad. Was I really breathing so loudly that you could hear me? The girl ended her strange recital, and there was a moment's silence in the cellar. Raxel merely nodded an affirmative to her concluding question. Well, Nella, my girl, said the millionaire at length, we are much obliged for your gymnastic efforts, very much obliged. But now I think you'd better go off to bed. There's going to be some serious trouble here. I'll lay my last dollar on that. But if there's to be a burglary, I should so like to see it, Dad, Nella pleaded. I've never seen a burglar caught red-handed. This isn't a burglary, my dear. I calculate it's something far worse than a burglary. What? She cried. Murder? Arson?
Should have sat from the
plot?
ship and peppered
How
them with the
splendid.
staffs that we got.
Mr. Babylon informs me that Jules is in London, said Raxel quietly. Jules! She exclaimed under her breath, and her tone changed instantly to the utmost seriousness. Switch off the light, quick! Springing to the switch, she put the cellar in darkness. What's that for? Said her father. If he comes back, he would see the light and be frightened away, said Nella. That wouldn't do at all. It wouldn't, Miss Raxel, said Babylon, and there was in his voice a note of admiration for the girl's sagacity, which Raxel heard with high paternal pride. Listen, Nella, said the latter, drawing his daughter to him in the profound gloom of the cellar. We fancy that Jules may be trying to tamper with a certain bottle of wine, a bottle which might possibly be drunk by Prince Eugen. Now, do you think that the man you saw might have been Jules? I hadn't previously thought of him as being Jules, but immediately you mentioned the name, I somehow knew that he was. Yes, I'm sure it was Jules. Well, just hear what I have to say. There's no time to lose. If he's coming at all, he will be here very soon, and you can help. Rexel explained what he thought Jules' tactics might be. He proposed that if the man returned, he should not be interfered with, but merely watched from the other side of the glass door. "You want, as it were, to catch Mr. Jules alive," said Babylon, who seemed rather taken aback at this novel method of dealing with criminals. "Surely," he added, "it would be simpler and easier to inform the police of your suspicion, and to leave everything to them." "My dear fellow," said Rexel, "we've already gone much too far without the police to make it advisable for us to call them in at this somewhat advanced stage of the proceedings. Besides, if you must know it, I have a particular desire to capture the scoundrel myself. I will leave you and Nella here, since Nella insists on seeing everything, and I will arrange things so that once he has entered the cellar, Jules will not get out of it again, at any rate through the grating. You had better place yourself on the other side of the glass door in the big cellar. You'll be in a position to observe from there. I will skip off at once. All you have to do is to take note of what the fellow does. If he has any
feel if I take the wheel, I might be going in the wrong direction.
We shall probably be able by that means to discover who the accomplice is." Lighting a match and shading it with his hands, Rexel showed them both out of the little cellar. "Now, if you lock this glass door on the outside, he can't escape this way. The panes of glass are too small and the woodwork too stout. So, if he comes into the trap, you two will have the pleasure of actually seeing him frantically writhe therein, without any personal danger. But perhaps you'd better not show yourselves." In another moment, Felix, Babylon, and Nella were left to themselves in the darkness of the cellar, listening to the receding footfalls of Theodore Rexel. But the sound of these footfalls had not died away before another sound greeted their ears. The grating of the small cellar was being removed. "I hope your father will be in time," whispered Felix. "Hush!" the girl warned him, and they stood side by side.
Behold the power of my empty
silence.
musket.
A man, cautiously but very neatly, wormed his body through the aperture of the grating. The watchers could only see his form indistinctly in the darkness. Then, being fairly within the cellar, he walked without the least hesitation to the electric switch and turned on the light. It was unmistakably Jules, and he knew the geography of the cellar very well. Babylon could with difficulty repress a start as he saw this bold and unscrupulous ex-waiter moving with such an air of assurance and determination about the precious cellar. Jules went directly to a small bin which was numbered 17, and took therefrom the topmost bottle. "The Romani Conti, Prince Eugen's wine," Babylon exclaimed under his breath. Jules neatly and quickly removed the seal with an instrument which he had clearly brought for the purpose. He then took a little flat box from his pocket, which seemed to contain a sort of black salve. Rubbing his finger on this, he smeared the top of the neck of the bottle with it, just where the cork came against the glass. In another instant he had deftly replaced the seal and restored the bottle to its position. He then turned off the light and made for the aperture. When he was halfway through, Nella exclaimed, "He will escape, after all! That is not a time! We must stop him!" But Babylon, that embodiment of caution, forcibly, but nevertheless politely, restrained this Yankee girl, whom he deemed so rash and imprudent, and before she
I
could
feel
free
like I
herself,
missed you.
the lithe form of Jules had disappeared. Chapter 24. The Bottle of Wine. As regards Theodore Rexel, who was to have caught this man from the outside of the cellar, he made his way as rapidly as possible from the wine cellars up to the ground floor, out of the hotel by the quadrangle, through the quadrangle, and out into the top of Salisbury Lane. Now, owing to the vastness of the structure of the Grand Babylon, the mere
the
distance
second time
thus
was
to
my
be
fault.
traversed amounted to a little short of quarter of a mile, and as it included a number of stairs, about 24 turnings, and several passages which at that time of night were in darkness more or less complete, Rexel could not have been expected to accomplish the journey in less than 5 minutes. As a matter of fact, 6 minutes had elapsed before he reached the top of Salisbury Lane, because he had been delayed nearly a minute by some questions addressed to him by a muddled and whiskey-laden guest who had got lost in the corridors. As everybody knows, there is a sharp, short bend in Salisbury Lane near the top.
Yep.
Rexel ran round this at good racing speed.
We
but
got
he was
distracted
unfortunate
by
enough
looking
to
at
run
each other
straight
funny.
up against the very policeman who had not long before so courteously supplied Jules with a match. The policeman seemed to be scarcely in so pliant a mood just then. "Hello," he said, his naturally
No, not
suspicious
at all,
nature
never mind.
being doubtless aroused by the spectacle of a bare-headed man in evening dress running violently down the lane. "What's
Oops.
this? Where are you for in such a hurry?" and he forcibly detained Theodore Raxel for a moment and scrutinized his face. "Now, officer," said Raxel quietly, "none of your larks, if you please. I've no time to lose." "Beg your pardon, sir," the policeman remarked, though hesitatingly and not quite with good temper, and Raxel was allowed to proceed on his way. The millionaire's scheme for trapping Jules was to get down into the little sunk yard by means of the ladder, and then to secrete himself behind some convenient abutment of brickwork until Mr. Tom Jackson should have got into the cellar. He therefore nimbly surmounted the railings of his own hotel, and was gingerly descending the ladder, when lo! A rough hand seized him by the coat collar, and with a ferocious jerk urged him backwards. The fact was, Theodore Raxel had counted without the policeman. That guardian of the peace, mistrusting Raxel's manner, quietly followed him down the lane. The sight of the millionaire climbing the railings had put him on his mettle, and the result was the ignominious capture of Raxel. In vain Theodore expostulated, explained, anathematized. Only one thing would satisfy the stolid policeman, namely that Raxel should return with him to the hotel and there establish his identity. If Raxel then proved to be Raxel, owner of the Grand Babylon, well and good. The policeman promised to apologize. So Theodore had no alternative but to accept the suggestion. To prove his identity was, of course, the work of only a few minutes, after which Raxel, annoyed but cool as ever, returned to his railings, while the policeman went off to another part of his beat, where he would be likely to meet a comrade and have a chat. In the meantime, our friend Jules, sublimely unconscious of the altercation going on outside, and of the special risk which he ran, was of course actually in the cellar, which had reached before Raxel got to the railings for the first time. It was indeed a happy chance for Jules that his exit from the cellar coincided with the period during which Raxel was absent from the railings. As Raxel came down the lane for the second time, he saw a figure walking about 50 yards in front of him towards the embankment. Instantly he divined that it was Jules, and that the policeman had thrown him just too late. He ran, and Jules, hearing the noise of pursuit, ran also. The ex-waiter was fleet. He made direct for a certain spot in the embankment wall, and, to the intense astonishment of Raxel, jumped clean over the wall, as it seemed, into the river. "Is he so desperate as to commit suicide?" Raxel exclaimed as he ran. But a second later the puff and snort of his steam launch told him that Jules was not quite driven to suicide. As the millionaire crossed the embankment roadway, he saw the funnel of the launch move out from under the river wall. It swerved into midstream and headed towards London Bridge. There was a silent mist over the river. Raxel was helpless. Although Raxel had now been twice worsted in a contest of wits within the precincts of the Grand Babylon, once by Rocco and once by Jules, he could not fairly blame himself for the present miscarriage of his plans, a miscarriage due to the meddlesomeness of an extraneous person, combined with pure ill fortune. He did not, therefore, permit the accident to interfere with his sleep that night. On the following day he sought out Prince Aribert, between whom and himself there now existed a feeling of unmistakable, frank friendship, and disclosed to him the happenings of the previous night, and particularly the tampering with a bottle of Romanée Conti. "I believe you dined with Prince Eugen last night?" "I did, and curiously enough we had a bottle of Romanée Conti, an admirable wine of which Eugen is passionately fond." "And you will dine with him tonight?" "Most probably. Today will, I fear, be our last day here. Eugen wishes to return to Posen early tomorrow." "Has it struck you, Prince," said Raxel, "that if Jules had succeeded in poisoning your nephew, he would probably have succeeded also in poisoning you?" "I had not thought of it," laughed Aribert, "but it would seem so. It appears that so long as he brings down his particular quarry, Jules is careless of anything else that may be accidentally involved in the destruction. However, we need have no fear on that score now. You know the bottle, and you can destroy it at once." "But I do not propose to destroy it," said Raxel calmly. "If Prince Eugen asks for Romanée Conti to be served tonight, as he probably will, I propose that that precise bottle shall be served to him, and to you." "Then you would poison us in spite of ourselves?" "Scarcely," Raxel smiled. "My notion is to discover the accomplices within the hotel. I have already inquired as to the wine clerk, Hubbard. Now, does it not occur to you as extraordinary that on this particular day Mr. Hubbard should be ill in bed? Mr. Hubbard, I am informed, is suffering from an attack of stomach poisoning, which has supervened during the night. He says that he does not know what can have caused it. His place in the wine cellars will be taken today by his assistant, a mere youth, but to all appearances a fairly smart youth. I need not say that we shall keep an eye on that youth." "One moment," Prince Aribert interrupted. "I do not quite understand how you think the poisoning was to have been effected." "The bottle is now under examination by an expert, who has instructions to remove as
One of
little
us
as
hit the
possible
one that
of the stuff
exploded.
which
I
you
don't know
put
which
on
one.
the rim of the mouth of it. It will be secretly replaced in its bin during the day. My idea is that by the mere action of pouring out, the wine takes up some of the poison, which I deem to be very strong, and thus becomes fatal as it enters the glass." "But surely the servant in attendance would wipe the mouth of the bottle." "Very
That was
carelessly,
it?
perhaps, and moreover he would be extremely unlikely to wipe off all the stuff. Some of it has been ingeniously placed just on the inside edge of the rim. Besides, suppose he forgot to wipe the bottle?" "Prince Eugen is always served at dinner by Hans. It is an honor which the faithful old fellow reserves for himself." "But suppose Hans—" Raxall stopped. "Hans an accomplice? My dear Raxall, the suggestion is wildly impossible." That night Prince Aribert dined with his august nephew in the superb dining room of the royal apartment. Hans served, the dishes being brought to the door by other servants. Aribert found his nephew despondent and taciturn. On the previous day, when, after the futile interview with Samson Levi, Prince Eugen had despairingly threatened to commit suicide, in such a manner as to make it look like an accident, Aribert had compelled him to give his word of honor not to do so. "What wine will your Royal Highness take?" asked old Hans in his soothing tones when the soup was served. "Sherry," was Prince Eugen's curt order. "And Romanée Conti afterwards?" said Hans. Aribert looked up quickly. "No, not tonight. I'll try Sillery tonight," said Prince Eugen. "I think I'll have Romanée Conti, Hans, after all," he said. "It suits me better than champagne." The famous and unsurpassable Burgundy was served with the roast. Old Hans brought it tenderly in its wicker cradle, inserted the corkscrew with mathematical precision, and drew the cork, which he offered for his master's inspection. Eugen nodded and told him to put it down. Aribert watched
got
with
2
intense
skills from
interest.
that one.
He could not for an instant believe that Hans
think the
was not
first
the
one
very
was,
soul of fidelity,
That was an
and yet,
action captain.
despite himself, Raxall's
This guy's
words
just
had caused him a certain uneasiness.
got
At that moment, Prince
a
Eugen
buried
murmured across the
treasure
table,
along here.
"Aribert, I withdraw my promise. Observe that. I withdraw it."
See,
Aribert shook his head emphatically, without removing his gaze from Hans.
right?
The white-haired servant perfunctorily dusted his napkin round the neck of the bottle of Romanée Conti and poured out a glass. Aribert trembled from head to foot. Eugen took up the glass and held it to the light. "Don't drink it," said Aribert very quietly. "It is poisoned." "Poisoned!" exclaimed Prince Eugen. "Poisoned, sire!" exclaimed old Hans, with an air of profound amazement and concern, and he seized the glass. "Impossible, sire! I myself opened the bottle. No one else has touched it, and the cork was perfect." "I tell you, it is poisoned," Aribert repeated. "Your Highness will pardon an old man,"
and you
said
had a
Hans,
treasure chest
"but
on
to
this
say that
island?
this wine is poison is to say that I am a
was
murderer.
the
I will prove to
treasure
you
map
that it is
that
not
action
poisoned.
captain dropped.
I will drink it."
So
And he
dropped
raised
that
the glass to his
Scottish
trembling
stone
lips.
and the treasure
In
map
that
dug
moment,
up for
Aribert
captain's
saw that
chest,
old
so-
Hans, at any rate, was not an accomplice of Jules. Springing up from his seat, he knocked the glass from the aged servitor's hands, and the fragments of it fell with a light tinkling crash partly on the table and partly on the floor. The prince and the servant gazed at one another in a distressing and terrible silence. There was a slight noise, and Aribert looked aside. He saw that Eugen's body had slipped forward limply over the left arm of his chair. The prince's arms hung straight and lifeless. His eyes were closed. He was unconscious. "Hans," murmured Aribert. "Hans, what is this?" End of chapter 23 and 24. Chapter 25 and 26 of the Grand Babylon Hotel.
Starting
This
to
is a
think Grand
LibriVox
Babylon
recording.
Hotel
All
will not
LibriVox
be
recordings are in
anything
the
like
public
what I
domain.
predicted it
For
to
more
be.
information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. The Grand Babylon Hotel by Arnold Bennett. Chapter 25. The Steam Launch. Mr. Tom Jackson's notion of making good his escape from the hotel by means of a steam launch was an excellent one, so far as it went. But Theodore Wexel, for his part, did not consider that it went quite far enough. Theodore Wexel opined, with peculiar glee, that he now had a tangible and definite clue for the catching of the Grand Babylon's ex-waiter. He knew nothing of the port of London, but he happened to know a good deal of the far more complicated, though somewhat smaller, port of New York, and he felt sure there ought to be no extraordinary difficulty in getting hold of Jules' steam launch. To those who are not thoroughly familiar with it, the River Thames and its docks, from London Bridge to Gravesend, seems a vast and uncharted wilderness of craft, a wilderness in which it would be perfectly easy to hide even a three-master successfully. To such people, the idea of looking for a steam launch on the river would be about equivalent to the idea of looking for a needle in a bundle of hay. But the fact is, there are hundreds of men between St. Catherine's Wharf and Blackwall who literally know the Thames as the suburban householder knows his back garden, who can recognize thousands of ships and put a name to them at a distance of half a mile, who are informed as to every movement of vessels on the great stream, who know all the captains, all the engineers, all the lightermen, all the pilots, all the licensed watermen, and all the unlicensed scoundrels from the Tower to Gravesend, and a lot further. By these experts of the Thames, the slightest unusual event on the water is noticed and discussed. A wherry cannot change hands, but they will guess shrewdly upon the price paid and the intentions of their new owner with regard to it. They have a habit of watching the river for the mere interest of the sight, and they talk about everything, like housewives gathered of an evening round the cottage door. If the first mate of a castle liner gets the sack, they will be able to tell you what he said to the captain, what the old man said to him, and what both said to the board. And having finished off that affair, they will cheerfully turn to discussing whether Bill Stevens sank his barge outside the West Indian No. 2 by accident or on purpose. Theodore Wexel had no satisfactory means of identifying the steam launch which carried away Mr. Tom Jackson. The sky had clouded over soon after midnight, and there was also a slight mist, and he had only been able to make out that it was a low craft, about 60 feet long, probably painted black. He had personally kept a watch all through the night on vessels going upstream, and during the next morning...
Very intense ship battle.
Huh?
There's an event up that's worth quite a bit of money, but would require us to do an extended ship battle, basically.
Maybe pass. Just because I'm not that good.
It would also probably take like an hour, and I don't really want to stay up that late.
I cannot find the bone merchant.
Order of Souls, look for the building close to the dock with the like blue and purple lanterns hanging on the outside.
Thank you. Because that's the person that wants the skulls, right?
Not a bad bit of change. I think we'll have made, what, about 50,000 by the time we're done?
I don't know. I don't even know what I want to do with it.
Buy a shirt for starters.
You think I should get rid of the hobo look?
It's up to you.
He had a man to take his place, who warned him whenever a steam launch went towards Westminster.
If that's what you're going for. The Sea Dog cosmetic set is all like scrappy looking, like patched together pieces of clothes.
Where do you buy them from?
There's a clothes store. I'll give you a tour of the merchants as soon as we're done turning in loot. Which, by the way, take this.
Does the rest of this just go to the gold merchant?
Treasure chests do.
Planes flying overhead.
At noon, after his conversation with Prince Aribert, he went down the river in a hired rowboat as far as the custom house, and poked about everywhere, in search of any vessel which could by any possibility be the one he was in search of. But he found nothing. He was therefore tolerably sure that the mysterious launch lay somewhere below the custom house. At the custom house stairs he landed and asked for a very high official, an official
Sounds good.
inferior only to a commissioner, whom he had entertained once in New York, and who had met him in London on business at Lloyd's. In the large but dingy office of this great man a long conversation took place, a conversation in which Raxel had to exercise a certain amount of persuasive power, and which ultimately ended in the high official ringing his bell. "Desire Mr. Hazel, room number 332, to speak to me," said the official to the boy who answered the summons, and then, turning to Raxel, "I need hardly repeat, my dear Mr. Raxel, that this is strictly unofficial." "Agreed, of course," said Raxel. Mr. Hazel entered. He was a young man of about 30, dressed in blue serge, with a pale, keen face, a brown moustache, and a rather handsome brown beard. "Mr. Hazel," said the high official, "let me introduce you to Mr. Theodore Raxel. You will doubtless be familiar with his name. Mr. Hazel," he went on to Raxel, "is one of our outdoor staff, what we call an examining officer. Just now he's doing night duty. He has a boat on the river and a couple of men, and the right to board and examine any craft whatever. What Mr. Hazel and his crew don't know about the Thames between here
Okay,
and
so we sell
Gravesend
everything
isn't
except
knowledge.
that chest.
Glad to meet you, sir," said Raxel simply, and they shook hands. Raxel observed with satisfaction that Mr. Hazel was entirely at his ease. "Now, Hazel," the high official continued, "Mr. Raxel wants you to help in a little private expedition on the river tonight. I will give you a night's leave. I sent for you partly because I thought you would enjoy the affair, and partly because I think I can rely on you to regard it as entirely unofficial, and not to talk about it. You understand? I dare say you will have no cause to regret having obliged Mr. Raxel." "I think I grasp the situation," said Hazel, with a slight smile. "And, by the way," added the high official, "although the business is unofficial, it might be well if you wore your official overcoat. See?" "Decidedly," said Hazel. "I should have done so in any case." "And now, Mr. Hazel," said Raxel, "will you do me the pleasure of lunching with me? If you agree, I should like to lunch at the place you usually frequent." So it came to pass that Theodore
Wait, that's the
Raxel and
Ashton
George
chest.
Hazel, outdoor clerk in the customs, lunched together at Thomas's chop house in the city of London upon mutton chops and coffee. The millionaire soon discovered that he had got hold of a keen-witted man and a person of much insight. "Tell me," said Hazel, when they had reached the cigarette stage, "are the magazine writers anything like correct?" "What do you mean?" asked Raxel, mystified. "Well, you're a millionaire, one of the best, I believe. One often sees articles on and interviews with millionaires, which describe their private railroad cars, their steam yachts on the Hudson, their marble stables, and so on, and so on. Do you happen to have those things?" "I have a private car on the New York Central, and I have a 2,000-ton schooner yacht, though it isn't on the Hudson. It happens just now to be on East River. And I'm bound to admit that the stables of my uptown place are fitted with marble." "Ah," said Hazel. "Now I can believe that I'm lunching with a millionaire. It is strange how facts like those, unimportant in themselves, appeal to the imagination. You seem to me a real millionaire now. You've given me some personal information, I'll give you some
Usually
in
what I'll do
return.
if I'm locking off
I earn
we'll just take
300 a
one of the
year,
supply crates
and perhaps
go
£60
down,
a year extra for overtime.
spawns in
I live
to
by
keep them.
myself, in 2 rooms in Muskery Court. I've as much money as I need, and I always do exactly what I like outside office.
Depends
As
if you're
regards the
looking
office,
at it or not.
I do as little work as I can, on principle. It's a fight between us and the commissioners who shall get the best. They try to do us down, and we try to do them
Let's
down.
check out the clothes
It's pretty
merchants,
even on the whole.
since I know
All's
you're
fair in war, you know,
obviously
and there
jealous
ain't
of
no
where I
10
got my
commandments in a
cool
government
friends.
office. Rexel laughed. Can you get off this afternoon? He asked. Certainly, said Hazel. I'll get one of my pals to sign on for me, and then I shall be free. Well, said Rexel, I should like you to come down with me to the Grand Babylon. Then we can talk over my little affair at length. And may we go on your boat? I want to meet your crew.
Every outpost has
That
the
will be
same
all
set
right,
of merchants,
Hazel remarked.
but the 3
My
different
2 men
regions
are
of
the
the map have
idlest,
different
most soulless
cosmetic
chaps you ever...
sets. Most are shared, but there'll be one unique one. So this is your weapons shop. You buy different pistols, blunderbusses, rifles, and swords in here.
I hit the wrong button. There we go. I actually have a little over 100,000 now, so I might be able to buy some cosmetics for this right now. Does it automatically apply, or do I have to go into the ship to change it?
You can change it at any armory box. So there's one on the ship. There's one right outside the shop. There are occasionally some on like outposts and things like that. Don't blow all your money here, though. There are 2 more vendors to visit.
Oh no, I'm not blowing all my money here. I'm getting like just a different sword and a different gun. Sword is almost 10,000 as well, though. I want it. I'm gonna get it.
Which one is it?
The one with the blue tip.
The Kraken cutlass in the top rail, first page.
Yeah, Kraken cutlass.
Nice.
Okay. Now I have new gun and new sword.
So right out here is the armory where you'll equip them. Oh, and I think that's the same blunderbuss I use.
That's okay. You got thousands.
Yeah, the Admiral blunderbuss. It's a very good design.
Yeah, I like it.
So, they eat too much, and they have an enormous appetite for beer. But they know the river, and they know their business, and they will do anything within the
So
fair
that's
game if they're paid for it, and aren't asked to hurry.
Will be your
That
your
night,
story.
just
This is
after dark,
equipment, so like
Theodore
compass,
Rexel embarked with his new
shovel,
friend George Hazel in one of the black-painted
any of that
customs
stuff
wherries,
you'll buy from
manned
this
by a
guy.
crew of 2 men, both the latter freemen of the river, a distinction which carries with it certain privileges unfamiliar to the mere landsman. It was a cloudy and oppressive evening, not a star showing to illumine the slow tide, now just past its flood. The vast forms of steamers at anchor, chiefly those of the General Steam Navigation and the Aberdeen Line, heaved themselves high out of the water, straining sluggishly at their mooring buoys. On either side, the naked walls of warehouses rose like grey precipices from the stream, holding forth quaint arms of steam cranes. To the west, the Tower Bridge spanned the river with its formidable arch, and above that its suspended footpath, 150 feet from earth. Down towards the east and the Pool of London, a forest of funnels and masts was dimly outlined against the sinister sky. Huge barges, each steered by a single man at the end of a pair of giant oars, lumbered and swirled downstream at all angles. Occasionally a tug snorted busily past, flashing its red and green signals and dragging an unwieldy tail of barges in its wake. Then a Margate passenger steamer, its electric lights gleaming from every porthole, swerved round to anchor, with its load of 2,000
Yeah, about the stuff I want. A lot of it I still left the same,
an air
but
of mystery, a spirit and feeling of strangeness, remoteness, and the inexplicable. As the broad, flat little boat bobbed its way under the shadow of enormous hulks, beneath stretched hawsers, and past buoys covered with green slime, Wraxall could scarcely believe that he was in the very heart of London, the most prosaic city in the world. He had a queer idea that almost anything might happen in this seeming waste of waters at this weird hour of 10 o'clock. It appeared incredible to him that only a mile or two away people were sitting in theatres applauding farces, and that at Cannon Street Station, a few yards off, other people were calmly taking the train to various highly respectable suburbs whose names he was gradually learning. He had the uplifting sensation of being in another world, which comes to us sometimes amid surroundings violently different from our usual surroundings. The most ordinary noises, of men calling, of a chain running through a slot, of a distant siren, translated themselves to his ears into terrible and haunting sounds, full of portentous significance. He looked over the side of the boat into the brown water, and asked himself what frightful secrets lay hidden in its depth. Then he put his hand into his hip pocket and touched the stock of his cold revolver. That familiar substance comforted him. The oarsman had instructions to drop slowly down to the pool, as the wide reach below the tower is called. These two men had not been previously informed of the precise object of the expedition, but now that they were safely afloat, Hazel judged it expedient to give them some notion of it. "We expect to come across a rather suspicious steam launch," he said. "My friend here is very anxious to get a sight of her, and until he has seen her, nothing definite can be done." "What sort of craft is she, sir?" asked the stroke oar, a fat-faced man who seemed absolutely incapable of any serious exertion. "I don't know," Wraxall replied, "but as near as I can judge, she's about 60 feet in length, and painted black. I fancy I shall recognize her when I see her." "Not much to go by, that," exclaimed the other man curtly, but he said no more. He, as well as his mate, had received from Theodore Wraxall 1 English sovereign as a kind of preliminary fee, and an English sovereign will do a lot towards silencing the natural sarcastic tendencies and free speech of a Thames waterman. "There's one thing I noticed," said Wraxall suddenly, "and I forgot to tell you of it, Mr. Hazel. Her screw seemed to move with a rather irregular, lame sort of beat." Both watermen burst into a laugh. "Oh," said the fat rower, "I know what you're after, sir. It's Jack Everett's launch, commonly called Squirm. She's got a 4-bladed propeller, and one blade is broken off short." "Aye, that's it, sure enough," agreed the man in the bows. "And if it's her you want, I seed her lying up against Cherry Gardens Pier this very morning." "Let us go to Cherry Gardens Pier, by all means, as soon as possible," Wraxall said, and the boat swung across stream and then began to creep down by the right bank, feeling its way past wharves, many of which, even at that hour, were still busy with their cranes, that descended empty into the bellies of ships and came up full. As the two watermen gingerly manoeuvred the boat on the ebbing tide, Hazel explained to the millionaire that the Squirm was one of the most notorious craft on the river. It appeared that when anyone had a nefarious or underhand scheme afoot which necessitated river work, Everett's launch was always available for a suitable monetary consideration. The Squirm had got itself into 1,000 scrapes, and out of those scrapes again with safety, if not precisely with honour. The river police kept a watchful eye on it, and the chief marvel about the whole thing was that old Everett, the owner, had never yet been seriously compromised in any illegal escapade. Not once had the officer of the law been able to prove anything definite against the proprietor of the Squirm, though several of its quondam hires were at that very moment in various of Her Majesty's prisons throughout the country. Latterly, however, the launch, with its damaged propeller, which Everett consistently refused to have repaired, had acquired an evil reputation, even among evil-doers, and this fraternity had gradually come to abandon it for less easily recognizable craft. Your friend, Mr. Tom Jackson, said Hazel directly.
So what's so special about the blue coins and the white coins? So what's so special about the blue coins and the white coins?
The blue coins are doubloons. They're just like an alternate currency for purchasing other stuff. Sometimes it's cosmetics, but it can also, like, you can buy gold with them as well as like other special voyages that tend to be like that. The voyage that I bought to find that Ashen Key was bought with doubloons, not gold. Clothes chest is here, all your clothes, and then the vanity chest is like makeup, hair, that sort of thing.
Axel committed an error of discretion when he hired the squirm. A scoundrel of his experience in Caliber ought certainly to have known better than that. You cannot fail to get a clue now. By this time the boat was approaching Cherry Gardens Pier, but unfortunately a thin night fog had swept over the river, and objects could not be discerned with any clearness beyond a distance of 30 yards. As the customs boat scraped down past the pier, all its occupants strained eyes for a glimpse of the mysterious launch, but nothing could be seen of it. The boat continued to float idly downstream, the men resting on their oars. Then they narrowly escaped bumping a large Norwegian sailing vessel at anchor with her stem pointing downstream. This ship they passed on the port.
Kinda hope.
So there's no third-person mode, but if you hold Z and bring up the emote wheel and you do something like dance or point, then you can move the camera around freely and look at your pirate.
I like my hobo chic. Yeah, I'm happy with this for now. I know I've got more doubloons that I could spend, but or more gold and everything I could spend, but I'm happy with this.
The only other thing is ship cosmetics, which are sold right by the dock. Those are all very expensive. You can buy like some sales or something for a couple thousand, but once you get into like proper cosmetics, it's like at least 25,000 a piece.
Yeah, save that idea for later.
Outside. Just as they got clear of her bowsprit, the fat man cried out excitedly, "There's a nose!" And he
We can start to run emissary flags, which essentially mark us as a high-value target, but also multiply the value of any treasure we turn in. Good way to make lots of money and reputation very quickly. As long as you can handle being a target.
What does this do? Ah, gotcha. I bought a bucket. What's the point of fishing?
There's a faction that will buy fish, which you can rank out. Like you can hit 75 in it, just like any of the other factions. And cooked fish are also excellent food. Like you know how bananas heal you a little bit. Cooked fish, you can eat each fish twice, and each time it restores, I think, half of your health and gives you some temporary regeneration. One of my favorite things, like one of the nice touches I think that I love about this game, is the pirates playing music like shit when they're drunk.
That's funny.
Sobering up. Better fix that.
He put the boat about and began to pull back against the tide. And surely the missing squirm was comfortably anchored on the starboard quarter of the Norwegian ship, hidden neatly
Where's that
between the
girl?
ship and the shore.
Damn it.
The man pulled very quietly alongside. Chapter 26. The Night Chase and the Mudlark. "I'll board her to start with," said Hazel, whispering to Rexel. "I'll make out that I suspect they've got dutiable goods on board, and that will give me a chance to have a good look at her." Dressed in his official overcoat and peaked cap, he stepped, rather jauntily as Rexel thought, onto the low deck of the launch. "Anyone aboard?" Rexel heard him cry out, and a woman's voice answered. "I'm a customs examining officer, and I want to search the launch," Hazel shouted, and then disappeared down into the little saloon amidships, and Rexel heard no more. It seemed to the millionaire that Hazel had been gone hours, but at length he returned. "Can't find anything," he said, as he jumped into the boat, and then privately to Rexel. "There's a woman on board. Looks as if she might coincide with your description of Miss Spencer. Steam's up, but there's no engineer. I asked where the engineer was, and she inquired what business that was of mine, and requested me to go through with my own business and clear off. Seems rather a smart sort. I poked my nose into everything, but I saw no sign of anyone else. Perhaps we'd better pull away and lie near for a bit, just to see if anything queer occurs." "You're quite sure he isn't on board?" Rexel asked. "Quite," said Hazel positively. "I know how to search a vessel. See this?" And he handed to Rexel a sort of steel skewer about 2 feet long, with a wooden handle. "That," he said, "is one of the customs aids to searching." "I suppose it wouldn't do to go on board and carry off the lady," Rexel suggested doubtfully. "Well," Hazel began, with equal doubtfulness, "as for that—" "Where's he off?" It was the man in the bows who interrupted Hazel. Following the direction of the man's finger, both Hazel and Rexel saw with more or less distinctness a dinghy slip away from the forefoot of the Norwegian vessel and disappear downstream into the mist. "It's Jules, I'll swear!" cried Rexel. "After him, men! £10 apiece if we overtake him." "Lay down to it now, boys," said Hazel, and the heavy customs boat shot out in pursuit. "This is going to be a lark," Rexel remarked. "Depends on what you call a lark," said Hazel. "It's not much of a lark tearing down midstream like this in a fog. You never know when you mayn't be in Kingdom Come with all these barges knocking around. I expect that chap hid in the dinghy when he first caught sight of us, and then slipped his painter as soon as I'd gone." The boat was moving at a rapid pace with the tide. Steering was a matter of luck and instinct more than anything else. Every now and then Hazel, who held the lines, was obliged to jerk the boat's head sharply round to avoid a barge or an anchored vessel. It seemed to Rexel that vessels were anchored all over the stream. He looked about him anxiously, but for a long time he could see nothing but mist and vague nautical forms. Then suddenly he said, quietly enough, "We're on the right road. I can see him ahead. We're gaining on him." In another minute the dinghy was plainly visible, not 20 yards away, and the sculling frantically now, was unmistakably Jules. Jules in a light tweed suit and a bowler hat. "You were right," Hazel said. "This is a lark. I believe I'm getting quite excited. It's more exciting than playing the trombone in an orchestra. I'll run him down, and then we can drag the chap in from the water." Rexel nodded, but at that moment a barge, with a red sail set, stood out of the fog clean across the bows of the customs boat, which narrowly escaped instant destruction. When they got clear, and the usual interchange of calm, nonchalant swearing was over, the dinghy was barely to be discerned in the mist, and the fat man was breathing in such a manner that his sighs might almost have been heard on the banks. Raxel wanted violently to do something, but there was nothing to do, and he could only sit supine by Hazel's side in the stern sheets. Gradually they began again to overtake the dinghy, whose one-man crew was evidently tiring. As they came up, hand over fist, the dinghy's nose swerved aside, and the tiny craft passed down a water lane between two anchored mineral barges, which lay black and deserted about 50 yards from the Surrey shore. "To starboard," said Raxel. "No, man," Hazel replied. "We can't get through there. He's bound to come out below. It's only a feint. I'll keep our nose straight ahead." And they went on, the fat man pounding away, with a face which glistened even in the thick gloom. It was an empty dinghy which emerged from between the two barges and went drifting and revolving down towards Greenwich. The fat man gasped a word to his comrade, and the customs boat stopped dead. "He's all right," said the man in the bows. "If it's him you want, he's on one of them barges, so you've only got to step on and take him off." "That's all," said a voice out of the depths of the nearest barge, and it was the voice of Jules, otherwise known as Mr. Tom Jackson. "Hear him?" said the fat man, smiling. "He's a good one, he is. But if I was you, Mr. Hazel, or you, sir, I shouldn't step onto that barge so quick as all that." They backed the boat under the stem of the nearest barge and gazed upwards. "It's all right."
Do we want to do another mission, or
"I've
do
got
you
a
want to call it
revolver.
for the night?
How can I clamber up there?"
I think I'm gonna
"Yes,
call it.
I dare say you've got a revolver all right," Hazel replied
Okay.
sharply. "But you mustn't use it.
It was
There
fun.
mustn't be any
We'll have
noise.
to do it another Friday.
We should have the river police down on us
Yeah,
in a
sure.
twinkling if there was a revolver shot,
Are you gonna keep
and it would be the
going,
ruin
or
of me.
should we,
If an inquiry-
sacrifice our ship?
Sacrifice meaning throw firebombs at it and let it go into the sunset?
Oh yes.
I wouldn't have it any other way.
Those are blunderbombs. Those are like frag grenades.
Aren't they the ones
They
that...
do damage, but they don't burn.
Oh. Oh, I set the ship a sail with you on it still.
That's okay. I made my way off.
So what happens to you if you die when your ship is gone?
Well, as soon as your ship sinks, it won't spawn a new one until you do something that would bring you back to your ship. Like if you die and respawn, or if you interact with a mermaid, then it'll spawn you a new ship at an island or an outpost somewhere and just put you on that. Like right now, if I were to take
see a burning ship off in the distance.
Was held, the commissioners wouldn't take any official notice of the fact that my superior officer had put me on to this job, and I should be requested to leave the service. Have no fear on that score, said Rexall. I shall, of course, take all responsibility. It wouldn't matter how much responsibility you took, Hazel retorted. You wouldn't put me back into the service, and my career would be at an end. But there are other careers, said Rexall, who was really anxious to lame his ex-waiter by means of a judiciously aimed bullet. There are other careers.
No, it's going away.
The customs is my career, said Hazel, so let's have no shooting. We'll wait about a bit. He can't escape. You can have my skewer if you like. And he gave Rexall his searching instrument. And you can do what you please, provided you do it neatly and don't make a row over it. For a few moments, the four men were passive in the boat, surrounded by swirling mist, with black water beneath them and towering above them a half-loaded barge with a desperate and resourceful man on board. Suddenly, the mist parted and shriveled away in patches, as though before the breath of some monster. The sky was visible. It was a clear sky, and the moon was shining. The transformation was just one of those meteorological quick changes which happen most frequently on a great river. "That's a sight better," said the fat man. At the same moment a head appeared over the edge of the barge. It was Jules' face, dark, sinister, and leering. "Is it Mr. Rexall in that boat?" he inquired calmly. "Because if so, let Mr. Rexall step up. Mr. Rexall has caught me, and he can have me for the asking. Here I am." He stood up to his full height on the barge, tall against the night sky, and all the occupants of the boat could see that he held firmly clasped in his right hand a short dagger. "Now, Mr. Rexall, you've been after me for a long time."
Yeah,
he continued.
I just closed
Here
out.
I am. Why don't you step up? If you haven't got the pluck yourself, persuade someone else to step up in your place. The same fair treatment will be accorded to all. And Jules laughed a low, penetrating laugh. He was in the midst of this laugh when he lurched suddenly forward. "What are you doing off aboard my barge? Off you goes!" It was a boy's small, shrill voice that sounded in the night. A ragged boy's small form had appeared silently behind Jules, and two small arms, with a vicious shove, precipitated him into the water. He fell with a fine gurgling splash. It was at once obvious that swimming was not among Jules' accomplishments. He floundered wildly and sank.
Alright, have a
When
good night.
he reappeared, he was dragged into the customs boat. Rope was produced, and in a minute or two the man lay ignominiously bound in the bottom of the boat. With the aid of a mudlark, a mere barge boy who probably had no more right on the barge than Jules himself, Rexall had won his game. For the first time for several weeks, the millionaire experienced the sensation of equanimity and satisfaction. He leaned over the prostrate form of Jules, Hazel's professional skewer in his hand. "What are you going to do with him now?" asked Hazel. "We'll row up to the landing steps in front of the Grand Babylon. He shall be well lodged at my hotel, I promise him." Jules spoke no word. Before Rexall parted company with the customs man that night, Jules had been safely transported into the Grand Babylon Hotel, and the two watermen had received their £10 apiece. "You will sleep here?" said the millionaire to Mr. George Hazel. "It is late." "With pleasure," said Hazel. The next morning he found a sumptuous breakfast awaiting him, and in his table napkin was a Bank of England note for £100. But, though he did not hear of them till much later, many things had happened before Hazel consumed that sumptuous breakfast. End of chapter 25 and 26.
You know what? I'm gonna actually call it there for the night. Yeah. I'll do the last 4 chapters of this book next week. I think Mr. Babylon and Mr. I forgot what his name is. I was just listening to it. Got the Belt Hotel. I think those are the only characters that I feel are good people. Everyone else is kind of like a little bit crazy, a little bit like not lucid. Like, I mean, his daughter pulled a gun on people and then got herself kidnapped. now they kind of won't pay the ransom for it or anything. It's all a little crazy. I don't know. Anyway, I appreciate anyone that wants to hang out with me and have a good time with me at night. If you like what you heard here tonight, like, comment, subscribe, and become a member of the Croth Crew. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.